Let me show you how much the United States spends on its military. Over here you've got Russia, China, India, and other big military powers. And yet, if you combine them all into one, the US still spends more than the next 10 countries combined. But I'm interested in what happens inside of this circle. Like, what are we spending our money on? In here, we'll see everything that the military spends their money on, from salaries for soldiers to elementary schools for their children. We'll see the $21 million helicopters, and these missiles that cost $1.6 million each. And we'll see how much the Pentagon spends on the development of new weapons, new technology, like these ship-based laser weapons. And of course, the most expensive of all, the F-35 fighter jet, that will end up costing the taxpayers $2 trillion. We even made a little model of this guy. And like the real thing, the model is continually breaking down. No, okay, here we go.
Yeah, the door thing is really hard to put in.
Yeah. Of all the money our Congress budgets to run our government on any given year, almost half of it goes to the military. Here you've got education, and there's diplomacy and health science, energy, environment. We've been deep in the spreadsheets and the data. Luckily, all of this stuff is pretty public and open to scrutiny, with the goal of visualizing all of this, trying to understand where the money goes, to understand why the US spends so much more than any other country on its military. And most important of all, to try to answer the question of whether all of this money actually makes us safer.
Almost all of our witnesses before the Armed Services Committee tell us that we are in the most dangerous global threat security since generations.
This is the Pentagon's budget for 2023. It's how they planned to spend money that year. It turns out that how much they spend on defense is pretty complicated and depends a lot on who you ask. So go to the sources, you can see how we got all these numbers and what decisions we made. The total number we got was $853 billion. That's more than the entire economy of Switzerland. It's a lot, so let's start to break it down. Close to half of all of this money goes to the vague-sounding category of operations and maintenance. This is $352 billion that we spend just on O&M. That's like larger than the entire economy of Portugal. Like, just to create the report, to get all these numbers assembled in one place, costs the DoD $269,000. But also, credit to the Pentagon and the US government for giving us all of this very clear data that we can shine a light on and scrutinize. A lot of countries aren't this transparent. So anyway, operations and maintenance. This is like all the costs required to keep the Department of Defense, one of the largest organizations in the world, running. It's a lot of not very sexy stuff like transportation, fuel, maintenance of equipment, administrative costs, training expenses. It includes $39 billion just for the doctors and health services for active duty personnel. And it also covers the stuff that you don't really think about when you think of military spending, like environmental cleanup in areas that the military has left unexploded bombs or spilled chemicals in the local environment. It also includes disaster relief and humanitarian money, which is something the military does as well. Here's nearly $1 billion dedicated to anti-drug activities. And here's $10 million for security at international sporting competitions. This huge category also captures the cost to run every one of the US's approximately 1,250 military bases, including the approximately 800 bases that are not in the United States, that are in other countries, which, by the way, are quite expensive to run because the US military has basically created a slice of America in these other countries. You've got Pizza Hut and McDonald's and Subway and grocery stores with products flown from the United States to make military personnel serving abroad feel like they're right at home. Okay, but let's just pause right here on this map because this is a good moment to recognize that the United States military is not a normal army. It is not a normal military. Most militaries are tasked with protecting their country, securing their borders. But the US military is so much more than that. It sprawls out throughout the entire globe, giving the US control over every corner of the planet, allowing the US to be the global policeman, where it enforces the rules and norms of the system that it created and from which it benefits immensely. So, one quick answer to this big question of why the United States spends so much more on its military is actually pretty simple, because this is the cost of being the global hegemon, the one who gets to enforce the rules and maintain control over the globe. Okay, but let's keep going on our budget. That's the point of the video. The next big category here is people, military personnel, $172 billion. Pay, benefits, retirement, healthcare for the over 3.4 million soldiers, reservists, and civilian military personnel. By some estimates, the Department of Defense is the largest employer in the world, though it depends on how you count it. The Pentagon also spends a lot of money on recruiting new talent, like the $28 million that they spent on hiring experts who work in artificial intelligence. Next, the military spends $140 billion on research and development. And a reminder, I know that these numbers are abstract and billion doesn't mean anything to anyone, but like $140 billion, that's the entire economy of Morocco that the Pentagon spends on R&D, thinking about the future, with the goal of maintaining technological superiority on the battlefield. Meaning they're working on new tech. It's a huge part of what the Pentagon does. Now, a lot of this stuff is classified, but we do know that the Pentagon is spending money on stuff like AI, using AI to analyze drone footage to improve their targeting capabilities, building autonomous submarines, or these insane military lasers that they use at sea to attack other ships. For years, they've also been trying to develop this exoskeleton that will supercharge the abilities of their soldiers, allow them to carry more weight over long periods of time. Although this technology, while potentially promising, isn't really there yet, but it might be soon. Now, the Pentagon pours a lot of investment into these technologies for the battlefield, but sometimes this tech actually turns into stuff that we use every day, like GPS, drones, voice recognition, the computer mouse, and the internet itself are all technologies that were first developed, at least in part, by the US military.
The World Wide Web, or the web, was created for and by the United States Department of Defense.
Let's quickly look at this smallest of the categories, still $19 billion, but compared to all these other ones, it's pretty small. This is construction, building new facilities, both at home and abroad. Like this little project, $85 million for jet fuel tanks in Japan, supporting force projection in the Pacific. Or it looks like they're proposing $75 million to spend on a new operations support facility in Southern California. And finally, we get to the part of the budget that you probably think about when you think of military spending: procurement. $167 billion, the entire economy of Ethiopia, to purchase all of this. Okay, I've always known that military stuff is expensive, but now I really know it. Let's look at some of this stuff. This jet costs around $142 million. The US bought 77 of them in 2023 and is asking for another $14 billion to buy 83 more this year. And they're pretty spendy to fly too. Look at these 4 cruise missiles parachuting out of a plane. Each one of these missiles costs $1.6 million. Oh, and the American taxpayer bought 600 of them last year. This vehicle costs $372,000. It's used to move troops around the battlefield. Last year we bought about 3,700 of them, and this year we want another 3,100. $2.8 billion buying 24 of these F-15s. For the Navy, this is going to cost $7.3 billion. $1.2 billion for these 56 Black Hawk helicopters for the Army. $8.2 billion for 3 destroyer-class ships, probably doing the same thing with those submarines. Fleet replenishment, Iron-class amphibious assault is going to be about $2.2 billion. I mean, it's a lot. And these are just a few tiny little samples. I'm just scratching the surface. And in fact, this diagram that looks so complex and granular is also highly simplified and condensed. Each one of these categories actually contains billions of tiny little things inside of it. This organization is much bigger than we could ever fathom. And in fact, it's much bigger than the Pentagon itself can even fathom.
The Pentagon has, up until this point in 2024, never successfully passed an audit. American taxpayers want to know how our tax dollars are getting spent. And the fact that the department that's getting such a huge chunk of the federal budget can't account for all of the dollars it's getting is definitely a problem.
For 6 years in a row now, the Pentagon has failed to pass an independent audit. They've brought in a bunch of accountants and said, tell us where all of our stuff is and what we spend our money on, and the accountants say, no, we can't do it. 61% of their physical assets are missing. They don't know where they are, which means they're probably investing a lot of money in stuff that they already have and they just don't know it. But my bigger question here is why? The United States pulled out of Afghanistan a few years ago. The war in Iraq is over, but spending continues to go up. And spending went down for like a split second, but look, it's going up again. Okay, well, first off, remember what we talked about earlier. The US is not a normal country with a regular military. The US is the global hegemon who uses its military to assert control and order over every corner of the globe. But there's another reason why this budget is so high, and this reason is much more infuriating to me. What our little graph here doesn't reveal is that most of this money is going to private corporations, who get 466 billion of these dollars, about 54%. And once again, the US government tells us exactly which corporations they give all this money to. We pulled the last 19 years worth of data on these private contractors. At the top of this list, you start to see the same names over and over. Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin. These are the names at the top of these lists, year after year. There used to be a lot of different defense contractors, but over the last 3 decades, they got gobbled up by these big 5. Transitioning, from the words of the Pentagon, from 51 to 5 aerospace and defense prime contractors. As a result, the DoD is increasingly reliant on a small number of contractors for critical defense capabilities. i.e., we've got kind of a monopoly issue on our hands. These 5 contractors own the space, and the Pentagon can't really go elsewhere if they need an F-35. There's only one shop in town that makes it. For this reason, the prices can get pretty out of control. Like the Pentagon used to pay $25,000 for this Stinger missile, and now they pay nearly $500,000 for the same missile. The price went up more than 16 times in just a couple decades. It's a little more than inflation.
There's a history of defense contractors overcharging the U.S. government. They can overcharge. If they're the only company producing a certain widget, then there's no competition. And that's one of the problems with monopoly, is if there's not competition, it's easy to overcharge the buyer. In addition, the Inspector General of the Department of Defense has found routinely that there's overcharging through corruption and waste and fraud. And there have been lawsuits. For example, KBR is a contractor that's been used overseas, and they were found to overcharge in dining halls by 30 to 40%.
It's also why a Pentagon inspector realized that the Pentagon was paying Boeing, yes, that Boeing, $3,357 for one ball bearing, a small little piece that the Pentagon could actually get for $15 in their own warehouse. $15.42 to be precise. When the Pentagon does get around to investigating these contractors, they sometimes find that they're taking huge profits, like 40 to 50% profit margins, giving them hundreds and millions of dollars above what they should be making in any kind of typical business environment. And what do they do with all these profits? Well, they pay their executives very well. But this list also tells us what they do. This is a list of how much money these defense contractors spend to influence our lawmakers into spending more money on the military so that these companies can make more money. You can see right here that Lockheed Martin is at the top of the list. So far this year, in this election cycle, Lockheed Martin has spent $2.7 million, split pretty evenly between Democrats and Republicans. This is a number that will continue to go up as we get closer to the election. And it is money spent to cozy up to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, contributing to their campaigns, bringing them out to show them how great their weapons are, doing whatever they can to make sure that the money keeps flowing to their companies. These companies also benefit from the infamous revolving door. The revolving door is not a literal door, it's a metaphorical door between the Pentagon and the defense corporations, which allows top military leaders like Jim Mattis to serve in the military for decades, retire as a general, and then join the board of General Dynamics, a defense contractor, only to pass through the proverbial door to become the Secretary of Defense under Trump. After which, he passes through the door again to go back onto the board of General Dynamics, bringing with him all of his insider knowledge and government contacts and influence. And no, this is not just Jim Mattis, this is a very normal thing that people do here in DC. One analysis found that in 2022, top defense companies hired 672 employees directly out of the Pentagon to work as lobbyists, board members, and executives. Go check my sources if you want to read more about this. I mean, yes, the revolving door is metaphorical, but it's also pretty physical and literal. I drive on this freeway all the time, and I'm always struck at how close all of this is. Over here is the Pentagon, and over here are all the defense contractors in an area of town literally called Pentagon City.
If there's someone working in government who is deciding on contracts and they have a conversation with someone who's going to receive that contract, the person in the firm can promise a good high-paying job after that government official is out of government. And so the government official then has an incentive to give a generous contract to the contractor because they know they're getting this kind of quid pro quo. They're going to get a high-paying job after they leave government.
And to add insult to injury here, some of the lawmakers who approve the Pentagon's budget own stocks in the defense contracting companies. Like, the lawmakers get richer if we spend more money on defense. No, why do we do this? Like, this is like classic, basic, simple, like, no, conflict of interest. We should not do this. This is not a thing we should do. But actually owning stocks in these companies is not the biggest way, I think, that our lawmakers are influenced by defense contractors. There's something more subtle going on here that I think is actually the best explanation, and it has to do with this excellent map. This map was assembled by an Air Force veteran and analyst named Christian Sorensen. This map makes it easy to see how contractors intentionally allocate their operations all across the country, spanning dozens of states and political districts. Building all of this stuff means jobs, which people like. So lawmakers are incentivized to keep these contractors making stuff in their district, to provide jobs for their people so they can keep getting elected. It's honestly brilliant. It's smart. This is political engineering. You can see it very clearly with lawmakers like Roger Wicker, a senator from the state of Mississippi. Senator Wicker is a member of the U.S. Senate Committee on Armed Services, which plays a huge role in giving taxpayer money to the Pentagon, which in turn feeds the bottom line of the contractors. Wicker loves the military. You often hear him advocating that we should spend way more on the military.
We need, in the United States, to spend more on defense. It's a necessity.
He writes op-eds in the New York Times calling for more shipbuilding. And when you look at his state, you realize, of course he does. The largest employer in Mississippi is this naval shipyard run by a defense contractor named Huntington Ingalls, which means more jobs and economic stimulus for Wicker's people in his state, which means a better likelihood of being reelected. Now, these defense contractors know that Senator Wicker is an important part of their bottom line, so they contribute huge amounts of money to his campaign to make sure he gets reelected. It's this virtuous cycle between Senator Wicker and the defense contractors that results in us spending more money on things that maybe we don't need to. Senator Wicker's job is to represent the American people. He sits on a committee that is supposed to be looking at our national security as a whole. And yet, thanks to the strategy of these for-profit defense contractors, this lawmaker has way too much incentive to advocate for more military spending, which is exactly what he does. My issue here is less with Senator Wicker or Congressman Mike Rogers, who has the same thing, sits on a committee, gives a bunch of money to the Pentagon, has a state where billions of dollars of defense contract money comes into, takes tons of money from defense contractors for his campaign, gets reelected, continues to approve more money for the Pentagon, etc. My issue is with the system that allows this to happen, that allows the money from our military spending to be used to influence our lawmakers into more military spending. It's so clearly a conflict of interest. And it is this system that has created an environment where there is very little political pushback to the endless ratcheting up of our military budget.
No congressperson wants to be the person who loses jobs in their district. Nobody wants to be the one known as shutting down a plant and people becoming unemployed. And so Lockheed can say, we have to have increased funding of this contract or you will lose jobs. And so that idea that jobs are essential, the Department of Defense spending is essential, really gives the contractor political power.
Let me make one point clear, which is that this isn't all corporate lobbying that contributes to the US spending so much on the military. That would be too lazy of an explanation. We live in a world where there's a well-documented paradox that explains that strong militaries are actually the key ingredient to avoiding conflict, in deterring an enemy from attacking, keeping a balance between big militaries so that no one attacks. Maybe someday we won't need militaries even close to the size that we have today. But it appears that in today's world, we still do need big militaries with credible threats to avoid the age-old human curse of war. And yet, on the other side of that paradox is the fact that if you grow your military, you force your adversary to do the same, to keep pace with you. The US and the Soviet Union did that for decades during the Cold War, each ratcheting up their military until suddenly both sides had over 10,000 nuclear warheads. That is madness. It diverges from the rational, and yet it's the logical result when we decide that the main solution to beating our rivals is to just make more weapons.
As the US spends more, Russia, China, other countries are spending more. If you look at the discretionary budget, about 50% of that goes to the Department of Defense, and only 1 or 2% of that goes to the Department of State. You can see where our priorities are. A show of force is really the first foreign policy of the US.
For this one, the explanation is easy. Diplomacy is hard and complicated and long. It doesn't make leaders feel as powerful and secure as having a big military does. And no one's getting rich off diplomacy. And yet diplomacy, international law and organizations, treaties, cooperation, that is how we solve our differences. That is how we have learned to live peacefully on this globe. The fact is, no one ever achieved sustainable peace by spending more on their military. And finally, we have to remember that while we pour so much into our military, that is money that can't be spent elsewhere.
If we increase defense spending, that necessarily has to mean something else decreases. Bigger piece of the pie for defense, smaller piece of the pie for other things. And those other things might be healthcare, education, climate change, and so on. And then we can also think of this notion of security. What actually makes us secure? Does spending more on defense make us more secure? If you look at other sources of security, having good roads and bridges, having safe drinking water, these are all things that Americans need investment in to be safe, to be healthy. So we're economically secure. People have jobs that they can go to, funding for college. Those are all sources of security as well. So it's not just military security we need to think of when we think of the federal budget.
I deeply respect the men and women who work and serve the country in the military. But I think that our laws and norms around how much money we give to the military prevents us from assessing this situation clearly. The system we have incentivizes the wrong priorities. Priorities that have a lot more to do with profit margins of companies and the electability of lawmakers. All of this setting us on a path of infinite escalation that risks ending in disaster. War used to be simpler. Violent, yes, always violent, but more straightforward. It used to be about large groups of men fighting with their muscles, their spears, and eventually their swords and their crossbows, and then their guns and their cannons. But then we hit a point where it just started to change so quickly, faster and faster, until eventually we got this. Private corporations who make unfathomably powerful death machines and then ship those weapons to every corner of the globe. I once heard about these guys who would make weapons and sell them 150 years ago, sell them to anyone who would buy them. These were industrial weapons. And sometimes they were sold to the opposite sides of really big rivalries, conflicts. I heard these guys started World War I, though I'm skeptical of that. This is something I've wanted to understand forever, the arms trade. As a student of conflict, it's something I feel like I have to understand. And I recently found a way to better understand it. In an old bookstore in Portland, Oregon, I found a book that has changed my perspective on this. It's called Merchants of Death. And it is surprisingly relevant to today, even though it was written in 1934. This book has been the center of something I've been thinking about in studying. Why do countries, especially the United States, make and sell weapons to every corner of the globe? That's what we're gonna get to the bottom of. And it all starts with this book. So I'll start with planting seeds. Just emailing experts. We're trying to map arms trade. Data is a huge part of this. Like, I want to make a map. I want to see it visually, and there's not a lot of clear maps out there. So we're going to make our own, but that's not easy. Look at my beautiful art here. Talk to the team, loop them in, let them know what we're up to. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Big lines coming out of either side. Oh God, I don't know what I'm doing here. All right, let's put the mapping aside for a little bit. Turn back to this book. This book is what hooked me on this topic, and there's a lot here. Our starting place is that point in history where war dramatically changed. Instead of large groups of men fighting with handheld tools, war became much more about fighting with machines, bigger and bigger. This was made possible by the massive amounts of energy that were found stored in coal and oil. Now, warships could be pushed by steam instead of wind, shielded by iron instead of wood. Armies and supplies could be brought to the battlefield on trains, out with the horses and in with the trucks. It's the late 1800s and the fires are burning hotter than ever. Metal is taking the shape of souped-up cannons and guns and ships, tools of war that were never thought possible, now flowing in abundance. Arms makers engineer war scares. They excite governments and peoples to fear their neighbors and rivals so that they can sell more armaments. The simple, relatively inexpensive weapons of earlier ages were displaced by highly scientific death machines. And the cost of these, together with the upkeep of huge armies, brought a rapid increase in national war budgets. So that's when it happened. And overseeing all of this production of industrial weaponry, not governments, but businessmen. But the arms merchant doesn't see himself as a villain. According to his lights, he is simply a businessman who sells his wares under prevailing business practices, the uses of which his products are put, and the results of his traffic are apparently no concern of his. No more than they are, for instance, to an automobile salesman. Still haven't heard back from a lot of experts, and still just kind of intimidated by this data set. One British arms manufacturer compared his enterprise to that of a house furnishing company, which went so far as to encourage matrimony to stimulate more purchases of house furnishings. The arms maker felt that he too was justified in promoting his own particular brand of business. Hey Stephen, Happy New Year to you. I'm curious if you can help us crunch this data. Would love your thoughts, and we'll go from there. The arms industry is undeniably a menace to peace, but it is an industry to which our present civilization clings, and for which it is responsible. CIPRI is this organization that shows all of the weapons being transferred from every country to every other country. So here's ChatGPT's initial take on the data set. It's really disheartening how horrible it all looks at first. So these lines are telling me nothing, and you know that at some point it will get into a pretty place, but it's not there, not even close. First up, Hiram Maxim, world famous as the inventor of the wholesale killing machine, a type of machine gun. Maxim invented this gun that could fire 666 rounds per minute. That was very fast, and crucially, it didn't jam like most machine guns. With his amazing invention, Maxim takes his gun out on the road all over the world to try to pitch it to different governments. He's in South Africa and France and Switzerland and Italy and Germany. His gun-selling missionary efforts eventually take him to Russia, where he was almost thrown out for looking like a foreign Jew. Man, that's like kind of aggressive. But then eventually he was able to stay and show them his gun, but they were skeptical. They're like, no gun can shoot 666 rounds a minute. But and they were incredibly impressed. His fame became so great in Russia that the Tsar invited him to visit him, which he did. He was also decorated with other Russian orders. The British eventually start using Maxim's gun in their big adventures in Africa. They were taking over modern-day Sudan and started using this gun against the locals who were fighting with swords. The British newspaper giddily reported that when the Maxim gun was turned on the Arabs, quote, a visible wave of death swept over the advancing hosts. In most of our wars, it has been the dash, the skill, the bravery of our officers and the men that has won the day. But in this case, the battle was won by a quiet, scientific gentleman living down in Kent. Yeah, this book is so good. War was changing, and Maxim was on the front lines of it, and he was making a ton of money in the process. China hears about the Maxim gun and immediately sends someone to go check it out. The Chinese representative gets to the UK, and the first words as he stepped off the ship on English soil were, "I should like to see Hiram Maxim." The Danes passed on the gun, the king himself saying that it would, quote, bankrupt my little kingdom in about 2 hours. But the King of Persia, the Shah, wanted some of these guns. So he asked the Prince of Wales to gift him some. And this is a key moment. The Prince of Wales says that he actually is not authorized to give the King of Persia any of these guns because they belong to Hiram Maxim's corporation. Pause here for a second. Do you see how this works back in the late 1800s and early 1900s? Governments couldn't sell weapons. It was the corporations that sold the weapons. They were the ones who were in charge. It was a free market of weapons. And the weapons kept flowing to everyone on Earth. And these guys kept on making a lot of money. Which gets us to our next character in the story, our next merchant of death. Basil Zaharoff, aka the super salesman of death, aka the mystery man of Europe, because he was, quote, a shadowy figure. This guy has an insane story, and someone should make a movie about him because his story is wild, but he was the super salesman of death. He went around Europe and around the world selling guns and submarines and all manner of weapons to anyone who would purchase them, including two sides of the same war. Like Greece and Turkey, which was the Ottoman Empire at the time, were definitely like arch rivals, and they would sort of break out into conflict at any moment. Zaharoff first goes to Greece and sells them some outdated submarines that the great powers didn't want to buy, and then goes right to Turkey and says, hey, Greece just bought a bunch of submarines, you need some too. And they buy some submarines. And then he goes to Russia and does the same thing. Hey, Greece and Turkey have these submarines, they're in the Black Sea, you probably need some. And indeed, Russia bought one because of that. And this guy's commissions go through the roof. It was rumored that Zaharoff became one of the richest men on Earth because of the arms trade.
Luckily, I have very skilled map friends that are going to help me make this data look pretty, including Marcus.
Hey Johnny, this is a multi-level problem, so I'm going to try to break it down.
Who invented the mapping tool that we use called geolayers.
So I've transformed your data and I have imported it here. And right now we can create a data-driven style.
So you have all these international businessmen that were making lots of money off of this new demand for industrial weapons. The Krupp family and their steel, the DuPont family and their gunpowder, Remington making guns, and of course Alfred Nobel, the dynamite king, who did go on to repent for his sins by creating a peace prize in his name. Peace, brought to you by killing machines, the paradox at the heart of international relations, and the theme throughout this entire video. These men got richer and richer, the weapons got better and better, until one day, it all blew up. The number and variety of death machines had never been equaled. All of the sinister engines of war, invented and perfected in the previous half-century, were used in the fighting. And naturally enough, there was further development of these during the war itself. The machine gun was improved, artillery was motorized, and its range became longer. Sights and fire control apparatus became more scientific and more accurate. Many new implements of war were invented. The tank, a combined American and French invention, was first used by the British. Hand grenades were supplied in the trenches, and rifle grenades increased the range of these deadly missiles. The First World War took place between 1914 and 1918, and thanks to all these new deadly chemicals and weapons, it was easily the deadliest conflict that the world had ever seen. Tens of millions of people killed or wounded. It was after this war that the world woke up and realized that making weapons a free market to be sold to the highest bidder was probably a bad idea. And that's when this book came out, in the 1930s. It was a part of a larger discussion and critique of the international arms trade. Some of these critiques went so far as to say that it was the arms makers themselves that exacerbated tensions between countries and caused the war, though most historians just say that the arms trade actually just exacerbated the violence by putting more weapons into the system. But then in the conclusion of this book, you have this kind of prophecy moment. The future may very well bring fiercer and more destructive wars, and increased business for the arms makers. If war continues, it is not at all fantastic to predict that the arms merchants will grow increasingly important. Already, the stage of national affairs has been reached where the largest item on national budgets is for past and future wars. Already, war appears the greatest and most important activity of government. The economic consequences of this new nationalistic militarism will soon be apparent in the arms industry. This new nationalistic militarism. It was new back then. It's not new anymore, but this is where it started. So now it's time to fast forward and see how right they were. All right, this is for MJ. This is the pass off for you to make a beautiful map.
Okay, so Johnny just sent me over the directions for the next map. This one is a bit complicated. I finally have a good map update to show you.
Today, the United States is the global superpower and the country who exports more weapons than any other country, and by a long shot. And this is what we've been working to try to map. All this data hunting and trial and error is to try to see what this looks like. Today, private companies still make and sell the weapons, but unlike in the Merchants of Death era, weapons sales go through a government approval process, which means that weapons are no longer just a product that make money for businessmen. Instead, they are a currency that countries use to purchase influence. In this case, the United States being the top country. Thanks mostly to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, we know where these weapons come from and where they go. This has been the bedrock of our data hunting, and I'm happy to say that after a fairly long process, we have mapped this. So, let me show you what it looks like when the global superpower uses weapons as a currency for influence around the globe. This map is pretty beautiful, and I'm really grateful for the team that helped me make it. I've got a great team, and it's helpful for seeing one really important thing, which is the expanse of U.S. arms trade, how far it goes, how wide it goes. The thicker the lines, the more weapons flow. But this map only shows us the first layer. In reporting this story, I've realized that there's a deeper way to understand this map. It's going to take a little extra reporting, which is why there's going to be a part 2 of this video, which dives into the modern arms trade, what it looks like when the US sells weapons all over the world, and why they do it. The purpose of this video was to introduce you to the Merchants of Death so that they could teach us about how the business of war came to be and what happens when that business goes too far. We've been busy mapping where weapons flow in this world, especially those that originate in the United States. And this is part 2 of a series on the arms trade. If you watched part 1, you'll already know that there's a long history of businessmen getting rich off of war. But I wanted to see what the weapons trade looks like today, using data. So after months of working on this, we finally got a map that looks nice. It looks pretty. The thicker the lines, the more weapons flow. So in this video, I want to go deep into these lines to show you what they can teach us about how the United States projects its power, about what happens when you sprinkle weapons all around the globe. I've been looking at every one of these countries, and with the help of my new colleague Sam, I'm hoping to bring you into a much deeper understanding of the American arms trade. I also want to let you in on some of the conversations I've been having with experts in this field, which for me was very helpful in decoding all of this.
Hello. I'm Jeff Abramson. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and I also lead something called the Forum on the Arms Trade, which is really where my passion is.
I'm Bill Hartzog. I'm currently a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I've been working on arms trade issues since the 90s.
Why do we sell weapons to other countries in the first place?
I mean, at the most basic level, it is to promote peace and security. When we talk about the currency of international relationships, sometimes weapons become that currency, and what we desperately need is alternate currencies.
Well, there's the textbook reasons and real reasons. The Pentagon would tell you it promotes stability, it helps allies defend themselves. So there's this kind of strategic argument, but it's really about if you believe the U.S. should be able to go anywhere, fight any battle, beat any adversary. It's kind of premised in a fairly militarized view of foreign policy.
The United States sold weapons to 103 countries, and that's major weapons. Generally, whenever the United States provides weapons to another country, they have to agree on how to use them, and they're not supposed to use them to violate human rights. But it's hard to see the leverage that the United States can use with that government.
One last thing I want to do before we dive fully in is give you a theoretical point in IR, international relations. Understanding this will help us understand this map much better. It's this concept of balance of power. The big paradox in international relations is that countries will naturally get into conflict with each other unless they calculate that it is unwise to do so, that they actually don't have a chance of winning or gaining anything. So countries are always building up their weapons so that they have just enough so that their enemy will not attack them, but not too much to where they will provoke some kind of escalation and their enemy will start to get into a race to have more weapons. Every country is making this calculation all of the time, this balance of power with their rivals in their region. And weapons systems and capabilities tend to be the ingredients that are used for that calculation, for that balance of power. When the US government approves a bunch of weapons being sent to some country, in all of their press releases, they always say the same thing, which is that this sale will not alter the balance of power in the region. An imbalance of power is what leads to escalating conflict and instability. What an irony that the promotion of peace and security is sell killing machines to other countries.
There are people who believe this creates better peace and security. At the moment of the transfer, it seems like a good idea. It feels like you've got to provide them, or like this is the only solution, is you put these weapons in this situation because we're out of options.
The first takeaway from this is just what you can see immediately, that the United States has a massive presence all around the world. You could look at these lines as almost tentacles of US influence in almost every country on Earth, selling jets and guns and tanks and missiles and bombs and radar and helicopters in exchange for influence.
I'd say at the real global level is this idea that if we are engaging in you in the arms trade, if you are buying weapons from us, we will have some say in how you act.
But that's about all this map will show you. The US has influence all over the world. It's something we kind of know. I want to get a deeper understanding of what's going on with each of these lines, which is why I reached out to my good friend Sam Ellis. Sam, what we are trying to do here is we want to understand the why. Because this map doesn't say why. It doesn't say like what is the US's motive in this. It's often securing the loyalty of a regime somewhere, and weapons are the currency for securing loyalty.
The US sometimes wants stability in the region, and it achieves that sometimes by wanting stability in terms of we picked you as a government, we would like you to stay in power.
One of the reasons we sell is so that we don't have to be the world policeman everywhere all the time, doing all the work. We can have people would basically outsource it to.
And what I'd like this map system to somehow convey is that what the US buys with the currency of weapons varies. And I think it would be really interesting to zoom in to some of these case studies and somehow show what the US is buying.
Yeah.
So stability, it's allies.
Ally, stability, resources, relationship. And we put all the categories on, and then you zoom into the different combinations. Let's zoom into Saudi Arabia, they have all four. Why do they have all four? Let's go to Colombia, they have two. Why two?
So when we zoom into these cases, we should be more descriptive and less analytical.
Like, what do you think the map is gonna look like? Like, do you think that the most weapons are gonna go to the countries with the most number of badges?
Yes. At the end of the day, there is a deep underlying force in all of this, which is that the more weapons we sell, the more money they make.
Yeah.
And the people in this town want to make a ton of money.
Okay, so the goal here is to take this map, which shows who the US is selling weapons to, and add what they're asking for in return. But that's a lot easier said than done. Because the US doesn't say exactly what it wants back for these countries in exchange for weapons, it's hard for us to make any definitive claims. But I think if we look at these countries' locations, their history, and their relationship with the US, we can surmise that the US is asking for basically 5 main things: stability, alliances, friendship, help against an enemy or a rival, and vital resources. So we looked at the more than 100 countries that the US sells weapons to and tried to estimate what they could give the US in return. And then we mapped it. So now we can see not only who the US sells weapons to, but we have an idea of why. And although this is based on subjective estimations by us, it's still useful to see that American weapons come with expectations, namely that these countries will help the US project its influence and its power all over the globe. So if we think of weapons as a currency, then the most common thing it's buying is friendship. Weapons are one of the most effective ways for the US to get other governments on its side, and so it's a goal of almost every weapons deal. But some countries have more to offer than others. If we zoom to Europe, you'll see that the US is also buying stronger allies. The US is in the NATO alliance with most of these countries, so the US sells them weapons as a way to make their defenses as strong as possible and to prepare them for the possibility that they may have to fight a war together. The US considers many countries allies, but we only included countries that the US is obligated to defend because it's signed a treaty. Ukraine is an example of a country that the US sells lots of weapons to, but isn't in the NATO alliance. Instead, the US is asking for Ukraine to counter an enemy. We've defined 4 countries as the main enemies or rivals of the US. The US often sells weapons to their neighbors as a way to fight a war against them or deter them from starting a new one. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, and so the US is selling Ukraine weapons, and in exchange, the US is stopping Russia from conquering it and other countries in the region. In the Middle East, the US sells weapons to a number of countries as a way to counter its other enemy, Iran. The primary example is Israel, who gets a huge number of weapons from the US. But the US also sells weapons to countries that control vital resources that it needs. In the case of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, that's oil. But a vital resource can also mean a strategic passageway, like the Suez Canal in Egypt, where a lot of the world's shipping goes through. By selling them weapons, the US is asking these countries to protect and give it access to these resources. In Africa, the US sells weapons to many governments, not just to secure resources, but also to try and make them more stable. War and coups have made many regions in Africa volatile and unpredictable, and the US hopes that by selling weapons to these governments, it can help them stay in power and maintain the status quo. It's important to understand that these labels often overlap, like in East Asia. China, a major US rival, is pushing to assert its control over this region, and the US is responding by selling weapons to countries standing in its way. Some are allies. Some control vital resources, like Taiwan's semiconductor industry. Then there are many that the US feels it needs to strengthen so that China can't destabilize the region. So now we can see not only where these weapons flow, but why. The definitions are based on some subjective categories that we came up with, but even still, it's useful to see that American weapons come with expectations that these countries will help the US project influence and power all over the globe.
So for the final chapter of this video, I'm going to address something that many of you familiar with the arms trade are maybe thinking about right now, which is, does all of this actually work? If weapons are a currency for influence and the US is using that currency to buy stuff, to buy influence or stability around the world, does that actually work the way that the Pentagon and the United States government think it does? The short answer is sometimes, but not really. Where weapons really do work is in keeping alliances strong.
There's no question some countries welcome it, allies like Korea and Japan and so forth, Australia, and it probably does cement those relationships, make it more likely they'll support the U.S. in a crunch.
But when it comes to trying to use weapons as an incentive to get countries to behave the way you want them to, that's where it kind of starts to break down. And the best case for this is Saudi Arabia. You can see on this map, we give a lot of weapons to Saudi Arabia. The Obama administration approved loads of weapons transfers to Saudi Arabia, and in doing so, we had some strings attached. A big one being that those weapons could not be used to violate human rights. Or from the horse's mouth, genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, serious violations of Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, attacks directed against civilians who are legally protected from attacks or other war crimes as defined by 18 U.S.C. 2441. Translation, Saudi Arabia is not to use these weapons against civilians in any of their conflicts. And yet, as Saudi Arabia has been waging this war against Yemen, they've done exactly that, using American weapons. They've bombed hospitals, weddings, and even a school bus. And we know that this is American weapons because investigators and journalists have looked at the wreckage of these attacks and looked at the actual serial numbers, concluding that these are American weapons, that they flow through these lines.
Although Saudi Arabia was bombs, most people in Yemen viewed it as an American war. Sent arms to Saudi Arabia that were used to slaughter people in Yemen, but there was sort of this notion of, well, they're an oil supplier, they're a bulwark against Iran, and those so-called larger strategic interests overrode the human rights imperatives.
Shout out to Bellingcat, the open source investigative journalism project that helped uncover a lot of this stuff. So Saudi Arabia isn't obeying the conditions that we put on these weapons. And Congress tried to pass a resolution that said that they were going to cut off some of this military aid that we were giving to Saudi Arabia. The problem is a lot of the power to approve these weapon sales rests with the executive, the president. So President Trump actually vetoed this resolution. And even under the Biden administration, even though there was a brief pause, the weapons have kept flowing, making it very clear that this leverage that the US thinks it has, because it's the provider of all of these weapons, is actually kind of reversed. Turns out Saudi Arabia has a lot more leverage than we thought.
You know, the idea is that the United States has kind of captured Saudi Arabia by having this weapons and defense arrangement, that the Saudis need to rely on us, they will do things that we ask them to do. Or I think the opposite is now happening. That Saudi Arabia has been able to turn the tides and say, hey, if you don't provide this, we'll find an alternate partner. The relationship has been perverted.
Okay, but Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. Maybe we have better luck influencing fellow democracies. So let's look at Israel, who receives more military aid from the United States than any other country.
I think Israel is the prime example of the lack of leverage that you would think a well-developed long-term weapons relationship would have.
The US government has come out and said that they are not happy with the way that Israel is conducting its war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And yet, what we see here is an effort to push more military aid to Israel, without any pause or withdrawal of these weapons transfers.
And that's the reality of the arms trade, is that we can hope countries will take things into mind, we can tell them we want to do things, but ultimately they end up making local decisions for their local needs.
There's a lot more cases just like this, like the Philippines, where the Duterte regime has used American weapons to carry out a brutal war on drugs, murdering and jailing civilians in the process. What's confusing about this is that, in some sense, the weapons are working for US interests. We sell them these weapons, we give them these weapons, we buy their support in deterring our enemy. But in the process, these weapons that we use as our currency are used for other things that have nothing to do with deterring our enemy. And sometimes it gets really out of control, like we give a lot of weapons to Turkey, a NATO ally. Turkey will then transfer that to its proxies in Syria, who will use them to fight against American-backed rebels that are also using US weapons. So American weapons are being used on both sides of a conflict. It just feels a little bit like deja vu from the book that was written 100 years ago, stating that this was a problem, and it still kind of is. The other big issue with using weapons as your main currency for influence around the world is that weapons don't just go away. Back in the 80s, the CIA transferred a bunch of weapons to rebel fighters in Afghanistan who were fighting against the Soviets. Decades later, those same weapons were being used by those fighters and their descendants to fight against Americans who were then invading Afghanistan. Same thing happened in Libya. We gave a bunch of weapons there and they leaked out and ended up in the hands of militants and insurgents in Syria and South Sudan. So if weapons are this currency that don't actually give us leverage and that can create more danger than stability, why do we keep making them and sending them to over 100 countries? There's a lot of answers to that question, but one of them has to do with money. There's a lot of money in making weapons. There always has been since the Industrial Revolution. Lots of these weapons are made all over our country, intentionally creating a network of jobs that no congressman ever wants to vote down. If a congressman votes to make fewer weapons, they could be voting against a factory or production facility in their district. Add to that some of our lawmakers own shares in these companies. If these companies make money, they make money. And yet they're the ones approving the money that goes to these corporations. A massive conflict of interest that we've reported on before in a previous video on insider trading. What you get is this military-industrial complex, a permanent economic business machine that is incentivized to make more and more weapons, both to prepare for war and provide national security, but also to keep people rich and to keep the constituents of lawmakers happy. So, in short, one of the reasons the map looks like this is to keep a bunch of private corporations nice and rich. Okay, well, that is the end of a journey for now. It started with an old book that really piqued my interest and brought me into a history that I didn't know about. And through this process, I feel like I've been able to draw a linkage between this history and how it works today, how for-profit corporations are still motivated to expand their business by making more and more killing machines. Now, weapons are a stabilizing force in our world. That is true, and that is an irony of stability in the world. You have to have weapons to have some kind of stability for now. Weapons also are political leverage that the US uses to keep the world somewhat stable. And yet, there's a lot to scrutinize and critique about the way that it's done. We're dealing with weapons. This is dangerous stuff. We should be able to properly criticize it and critique it. But instead, our ability to do that is hindered by the conflict of interest and the incentives that are brought on by these for-profit corporations and their relationship to our lawmakers. To me, this is what's wrong about the system. It perverts our ability to actually look into it, to actually scrutinize it properly, and to actually make the best decision for the safety and stability of our world. The weapons industry got out of control in the early 1900s and ended up contributing to the worst devastation the world had ever seen, which woke us up to actually being able to criticize this and trying to change it. A lot of those same conflicts of interest that keep war permanent and enriching still exist today. And my hope is that it doesn't take another devastating conflict for us to wake up. Hey, before we get back to the video, I want to thank today's sponsor, which is Saley. I've spent most of this year traveling, working on a big documentary series that you will hear about very soon, but I've been filming all around the world. And one of the things that I absolutely need anywhere I go is to get my phone connected to solid data. And that's why I've been using Saley. If you haven't used an eSIM before, it's basically a digital SIM card, nothing physical here. Before I leave on a trip, I just open up the Saley app and choose the country I'm traveling to, and then pick the data plan that I want. And then because I have a discount code with them, I enter that, which is Johnny Harris, and that's it. Everything is set up before I even get on an airplane. When I land, my phone is already connected to data. I can text my family to tell them that I made it safely. I can pull up Google Maps, call an Uber, whatever. All without having to go to one of those kiosks and get a SIM card or figure out the complicated reality of like roaming charges and all of that. What I love about it is that once you've installed the Saley app, you don't have to install a new eSIM card every time you travel. They have an affordable data plan for over 200 destinations. So whenever I'm headed somewhere new, I just open the app, choose the plan, and I'm ready to go. And if you travel a lot, it's definitely worth checking out Saley Ultra, which is a premium plan with unlimited data and some travel perks like lounge access. So if you're going abroad anytime soon, I definitely recommend checking Saley out. And again, you can use the code Johnny Harris to get 15% off at checkout. So go download the Saley app or go to saley.com/Johnny Harris. Links in the description. Thanks Saley for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back to it. I want to show you this map of the 54 countries that participated in a secret CIA program to abduct people from all around the world and hide them so that they could secretly interrogate them using violence, both physical and psychological. This story begins 6 days after 9/11, when George W. Bush signs a memo giving the CIA free rein to secretly capture and detain suspected terrorists. But the question became what to do with these suspects once they were captured. Putting them in prison in the US would be problematic because it would mean that the US would have to follow the rules of war, which entails declaring them as prisoners of war and giving them access to a lawyer and a trial. And, crucially, no torture allowed. Those are the rules that most of the world has agreed upon. And the CIA didn't want to play by these rules. The country was raging with anger and a thirst for revenge against those who did this. For the CIA, the rules would just slow them down in their hunt for the intelligence they needed to not only find the terrorists, but to stop future attacks. So the CIA looked abroad and began constructing a global network of secret prisons that would allow them to abduct and detain people outside of the view of the public, the press, and the law. The first target was a Palestinian citizen named Abu Zubaydah. He was hiding in Pakistan, and the CIA believed that he was a top al-Qaeda leader. In March 2002, CIA and FBI forces capture him in a raid in Pakistan. Zubaydah was shot in this raid and almost didn't survive. So the CIA flew in a doctor from a top US hospital to treat his wounds. They needed to keep him alive so that they could extract intelligence from him, vital knowledge that the CIA wanted. But where to take him? The CIA had decided on Thailand, where they had worked out a deal with the Thai government, where the CIA could use this old US military base for whatever they were up to here. This facility became known as Detention Site Green. And the plan was to get Zubaydah to talk using, quote, novel interrogation methods, meaning they were planning on using torture. But there was yet another problem: the law. Capturing people in someone else's country and then sending them to a third country without any plan to give them a trial or apply local laws, and then using torture, is all illegal, according to both international and American laws. So one key step in this effort was to ask the government lawyers back in Washington to create a legal justification for what they were about to do. And the lawyers did exactly what they were told. They drafted up a series of memos that argued that al-Qaeda members were not typical soldiers. Instead, they would be considered, quote, unlawful enemy combatants. So according to the legal theory in this memo, which was meant to remain secret, the rules don't apply here. So the CIA got their legal justification. But even still, the CIA agents in Thailand needed to make sure that none of this would get out. They send this cable back to Washington, D.C., asking for, quote, assurance that Abu Zubaydah would remain in isolation and incommunicado for the remainder of his life. And here we see in a cable from Washington that they gave these agents that assurance. Before I go on, let me note that I will not be going into detail about the interrogation techniques used by the CIA. I think that is well covered elsewhere. So instead, I will be using sterile words like enhanced interrogation, partly because I'm publishing this to a lot of people and I want to make sure that this video remains accessible to a large audience, including younger viewers, and partly to spare all of you of these details. I believe that the story can be well understood without those details. If you do want more information on this, go to the sources in my description where all of this is documented. Okay, so the CIA has their first secret prison and it's in Thailand. And Abu Zubaydah secretly remains there for 9 months, during which the CIA uses its expanded authority to torture this man to get information that they think will help them catch more terrorists. But here comes another problem for the CIA. The Thai government officials are starting to learn more about the secret program and are becoming uncomfortable with the CIA doing this in their country. Not to mention, the media starts poking around and learning more details about what the CIA is up to. So much so that Vice President Dick Cheney himself tries to convince an American news outlet not to publish any of the details. They partly comply, but the whole thing spooks the CIA. They realize that they need to leave Thailand. The This is the CIA moving its secret prisoners from Thailand to another location, but they would have to cover their tracks. And that's how we get this document. We're looking at a receipt for the booking of a private jet through a contractor working with the CIA. We see that they booked a Gulfstream 4 to go from DC to Thailand. This is where they loaded up Abu Zubaydah and a few other secret prisoners. They then fly to the United Arab Emirates. And here's where things get interesting, because from there, the official flight records say that this plane went to Austria and then London, but it actually didn't. This is a dummy flight record that the CIA planted so that we would never know what they actually did. But because of this receipt, we know that they actually flew to a small airport in rural Poland. The CIA then drives their prisoners 20 minutes from this little airport to a military prison in the woods. The CIA had paid the Polish intelligence agency $15 million of cash delivered in cardboard boxes, all in exchange for the use of this facility, their second secret terrorist torture prison, or what we're now going to call Black Site. This one was called Detention Site Blue. This is where they would continue their interrogation work, continuing to abduct suspected terrorists and quietly bringing them here, often scrambling their flight paths and faking their flight records so that this story could never be told, and continuing to use violent torture to interrogate their prisoners. But again, this couldn't last too long. After a year, they were on the move again, worried that the world was catching on. So in September 2003, and here comes another series of flight paths, from Washington, D.C., bouncing around a few countries before ending up in Poland, where they loaded up their secret prisoners once again and took off. Headed to Romania, where the CIA had negotiated access to the basement of a government building in September 2003, their next black site. And then to Morocco, where the CIA was negotiating with the government for another black site. They ended up paying $20 million to build a prison that was codenamed Bombay. But in the end, they never used it, instead using Morocco's local prisons to house their prisoners for a short time. And then over to Cuba, to the US naval base at Guantanamo Bay, where they opened two black sites, Detention Site Maroon and Indigo. These sites were kept separate from the military prison at Guantanamo Bay. And honestly, not much is known about them. In fact, they're only mentioned one time and in a footnote in this Senate report that eventually came out. Look at this map. This is one way to visualize the global network that the CIA created. These are the known flight paths that the CIA took to transfer prisoners around their black sites. By 2004, they had captured about 100 prisoners, consistently moving them around, hoping to stay out of the light, out of the scrutiny of the public, the press, and oftentimes the home governments of these places where they were moving their prisoners. And by the way, all of this data, these flight paths, this information, we know about because of an investigation and a Senate report that later came out, and some amazing investigative journalism by the Rendition Project, who boiled a lot of this down, pieced together a lot of the information, and allowed us to see this in an accessible way. You can find so much more detail at the Rendition Project website if you want to check that out. Let's look at this network again. The CIA using 54 countries to traffic their secret flights through to cover their tracks from the law and the press. This reportedly includes a little-known British territory in the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia. And in the end, the CIA had a total of 9 secret prisons, at least that we know of. The network included another Eastern European country, a prison in Lithuania, where the CIA used a shell company to purchase this nondescript barn that had been an elite horse riding club. It was called Detention Site Violet. They ran 4 of these secret prisons in Afghanistan, including one that was nicknamed Dark Prison because prisoners were held in metal shipping containers in complete darkness and isolation, sometimes with loud music playing to keep them awake, among other horrific treatment. The CIA would also work with countries like Jordan and Egypt, where their intelligence officers would use torture, but the CIA agent would be right there, guiding the whole thing. And there's evidence that the CIA also turned ships into black sites, floating prisons where they could interrogate their prisoners on international water. All in all, the CIA ended up interrogating 119 prisoners using this network of black sites. And of the 119, they ended up releasing 94 of them. Some were sent to foreign custody, some were just released, and some have a status that is still unknown. And some turned out to be totally innocent, like Maher Arar, who was a Canadian-Syrian dual citizen, who was taken by the CIA in an airport in New York on his way back home to Canada. Then he was transferred to Syria and tortured for a year before the CIA realized that he was the wrong guy. The Canadian government ended up paying him $10 million for his troubles. One guy named Gul Rahman died of hypothermia at a black site in Afghanistan while he was chained naked to a concrete floor. No CIA officers were punished. One German citizen was held and interrogated in a hotel room in Macedonia for 23 days before being flown to Afghanistan and imprisoned for 4 months. Before the CIA realized that, once again, he was the wrong guy, he was released with a meager apology and a small payment. But then there's prisoners like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who most people consider the mastermind of 9/11, the guy who planned it. Or Abd al-Nashiri, who's charged with planning the bombing of an American Navy ship just before 9/11, the USS Cole. Or this guy, Hambali, who's known as the Osama bin Laden of Southeast Asia. Like, these are guys who need to face justice. They are most likely responsible for the gruesome murder of thousands of innocent people. And in a post-9/11 America, there was so much anger and need for revenge. The idea was that torture was totally justified, especially if it stopped another attack. But what's really happening here with this massive network of secret prisons and this enhanced interrogation is that the CIA is falling into Al-Qaeda's trap. And internally, you start to see how people in the CIA know that this is actually a bad idea. Many stopped wanting to participate in the enhanced interrogation. Some were brought to tears while witnessing it. One memo shows how the CIA started sending their worst people to do these interrogations, leading to mediocre or useless intelligence. And while all of this was secretly happening, President Bush was publicly saying,
I want to be absolutely clear with our people and the world. The United States does not torture. It's against our laws and it's against our values. I have not authorized it and I will not authorize it.
But eventually the world would catch on. The Washington Post was one of the first to report on this in detail. And then a former CIA chief of counterterrorism in Pakistan, the one who directed a lot of the raids to capture these prisoners, went public, telling a journalist that the CIA had been waterboarding prisoners, a torturous technique that induces the sensation of drowning over and over.
At a slight incline, there's some cellophane or material over your mouth, and then they pour water on this cellophane. You can't breathe, and it feels like the water is going down your throat.
But you might be thinking that if we're talking about terrorists, people who have committed heinous atrocities against innocent people, that the normal rules and values that we abide by don't apply here, especially if these techniques could potentially give us information that would thwart the next horrific attack and save thousands of lives. In that case, isn't torture justified? Well, it turns out that in addition to being a violation of our own values, torture doesn't actually work. There's been extensive research on this that finds that despite what the movies say, torture doesn't work. It creates stress, making it harder for the person being interrogated to remember facts, and often pushes them to make up information to get the torture to stop. There are many cases of this happening within the CIA Black Site program. Like when the mastermind of 9/11 was being waterboarded hundreds of times, he finally gave the names of 2 men who the CIA spent a bunch of time going to capture only to learn that they had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda or terrorism. It's just not as straightforward as you would imagine. But the CIA disagrees. They said that they got useful intelligence on this. So the Senate, when they were investigating this program, went case by case to actually evaluate whether or not torture led to useful intelligence, ones that thwarted the terrorists' plans. And what they found was that there was, quote, no relationship between the information from torture and thwarting these plots and stopping the next terror attack. They found that the CIA did get useful intelligence from these prisoners, but not from torture, and that they often tried to retroactively justify the torture by saying that useful intelligence did come out of the program. But most of the time, that information was gained from other sources, or it was information that the government already had. And even worse, they found that the CIA never actually did an evaluation on how useful these techniques were. They just kind of did them, evading any kind of accountability and oversight that would make this not only ethical and legal, but also effective in getting the intelligence they were after. Overall, the conclusion of this report is that, quote, the CIA's use of its enhanced interrogation techniques was not an effective means of acquiring intelligence or gaining cooperation from detainees. So they shut the program down, and of the 119 men who went through these black sites, 21 of them remain in the custody of the United States government at the military base in Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. But of all of these people, only 3 of them have faced any version of a trial of justice where evidence is presented and a verdict is given. And this gets to what to me is the worst outcome of this torture program, which is that it turned into a massive success for the terrorists who attacked Washington, D.C. and New York on that day. Al-Qaeda successfully provoked the United States and the CIA to lash out in revenge, to violate their own norms and values, the ones that they preach to the rest of the world, to lay bare the hypocrisy of the United States, which is something that a lot of the world already has a problem with. The view that the US is a hypocritical empire, eager to preach about human rights and rule of law, but quick to violate those very values when they become inconvenient. And in the process, not only did the CIA fail to get any useful intelligence out of this, but they also turned these men into victims. Like the guy who probably planned the USS Cole bombing that killed dozens of US sailors, that guy should face justice. He should sit in a courtroom and have his crimes proved to the public, and he should be punished at a measure that is proportional to his crime. However, due to the CIA's use of brutal and illegal torture, his case has been totally tainted. The evidence obtained in his interrogation is now inadmissible in court. He's even been granted victim status in the European Court of Human Rights for the torture he endured in Poland, forcing Poland to pay him 100,000 euros. And so now the families of those who died in that horrific bombing have no closure. The person who did this will never be brought to justice. And this goes for so many of the men who plotted and executed the 9/11 attacks. If you go to their Wikipedia page, you're going to see a lot about what the CIA did to them, the black site program that they were a part of. The reason why I call it a trap is because the CIA, in doing what they did, helped turn these men into symbols of American hypocrisy, whereas they should be seen as symbols of terror. When we stoop to the level of revenge, the most primitive form of justice, we go backwards. We erode the foundations of our system, what we've built. And then, of course, our government and our press has to spend years or decades picking up the pieces, shining a light on all of it, making sure we stand accountable, and that hopefully we learn from our mistakes.
This was a struggle of Cuban patriots against a Cuban dictator.
On March 13th, 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff put this document in front of the Secretary of Defense for approval from the President. This is a memo prepared by the most senior leaders in the US military, some of the most powerful men in the country.
and they're asking for permission to execute a plan to lob mortar shells into their own military bases, with some damage to installations, and then to make hijacking attempts against civilian air and surface craft. They're proposing to blow up a U.S. ship in the U.S. naval base Guantanamo Bay, and even to conduct a terror campaign on American soil, exploding a few plastic explosives in carefully chosen spots. We're looking at a plan to blow things up on American soil and then to blame it all on Cuba.
The Cuban people have not yet spoken their final piece.
This operation never happened, but it almost did, and that gets to a big question. Why would some of America's most powerful leaders charged with safeguarding our nation think that their duty would require them to lie to and terrorize the American people? In other words, why were they planning Operation Northwoods?
It is not the first time that communist tanks have rolled over gallant men and women. Let the record show that our restraint is not inexhaustible.
Operation Northwoods was a response to a problem the US government had. They called it the Cuba problem. Cuba became a problem for the CIA when they watched this young activist with an affinity for cigars lead a communist revolution on the island, throwing out the American-friendly dictator and nationalizing all the valuable land and industries that American businesses had been getting rich off for decades. This was the Cold War, and communism was now 90 miles away, threatening to spread to other countries in Latin America, countries that American businesses also wanted to continue controlling and exploiting. And any day, this new leader could align with the Soviet Union, giving the US's biggest geopolitical rival a military base within breathing distance of Florida. So this was what the Joint Chiefs called their Cuba problem. The US had a few solutions to their problem. First, they put an embargo on Cuba, blocking all US exports to the country, except for food and medicine. Second, they stopped buying Cuba's largest export, sugar. This actually ended up backfiring when the Soviet Union stepped in to buy Cuban sugar, kicking off an economic alliance between these two communist countries, exactly what the US didn't want. And third, the US started making plans. Lots of plans. Plans to somehow get rid of Castro, to turn Cuba back into the American business-friendly client state, through whatever means necessary. In one of these secret plans, called Operation Zapata, the CIA recruited 1,500 Cuban exiles who fled to Miami during the Cuban Revolution. It was this little CIA-funded army called Brigade 2506, and the goal was to have them invade Cuba and remove Castro from power. So the CIA trains them at this camp in the mountains of Guatemala, where they had just recently executed a coup and installed a US-friendly dictator. And right in the middle of the planning stages of this operation, JFK wins the presidency.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
And he inherits this scheme to invade Cuba using exiled Cubans. The CIA briefs him on it, this plan to fix the Cuba problem by forcibly unseating Castro using Cuban exiles. And after some debate, JFK approves the plan. So on the 17th of April, 1961, they launched their invasion. Brigade 2506 landed on Playa Girón with the plan to invade the island and spark a popular revolution against Castro.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro. Landings were effected by rebels at several...
But it was a complete failure. Castro had found out about the invasion ahead of time. A radio station on the beach had spotted the invading ships arriving and called for help. Several of the invading ships sank on the coral reef, and the invading forces were met with immediate resistance from Cuban armed forces who defeated them within 3 days. Most of them were captured. 9 US servicemen actually flew combat missions in support of this invasion, 4 of which were shot down and killed in the process, something the US government and the CIA would go on to deny for almost 30 years. But the point is that this invasion failed miserably, and JFK and his administration were to blame.
For too long, we have fixed our eyes on traditional military needs, on armies prepared to cross borders, on missiles poised for flight. Now it should be clear that this is no longer enough.
JFK would later fire the CIA director, holding him responsible for the disastrous invasion plan that we know as the Bay of Pigs. But this didn't change anything. The US government was still obsessed with removing Castro from power. They just needed a new plan. So JFK initiates his own plan, called the Cuba Project, aka Operation Mongoose. Over the next year, the CIA employs hundreds of spies to collect intelligence on Cuba. They send submarines on recon missions to Cuban waters. They fund anti-Castro protest movements, spreading propaganda throughout the country. They sabotage Cuban infrastructure to create chaos, and they make dozens more plans to assassinate Castro directly, including preparing poisonous pills to be planted in a beverage to be drunk by Castro. They even hired the American mafia to deliver the pills, knowing that the mafia had their casinos kicked out of Havana during the revolution and would want revenge. But none of this worked. The assassination attempts all fell apart. Fidel Castro still remained in power, and his support wasn't wavering. And the US military was getting desperate. They needed to solve the Cuba problem before the Soviets could get more involved on the island. So after all these botched assassination attempts and failed invasions, the Joint Chiefs of Staff concluded that the only way to get rid of Castro was for the US military itself to invade Cuba and take him out. But they knew that the US public would not support an outright invasion. They needed to create a reason, a justification. And this gets us back to our document. The one that went to the Secretary of Defense for the President's approval. This cover and deception plan to make attacks on American targets, fake attacks that will be blamed on Cuba to raise tensions between the US and Cuba to justify an invasion, a legitimate provocation as the basis for a US military intervention in Cuba. In other words, a lie to the American public and the international community, a series of false flags to get what they wanted, and all detailed in this classified document that was only meant for a few people, with hopes that the president would approve in the spring of 1962.
If the nations of this hemisphere should fail to meet their commitments against outside communist penetration, then I want it clearly understood that this government will not hesitate in meeting its primary obligations, which are to the security of our nation.
So let's see what this plan actually says. It starts with the US military base at Guantanamo Bay, where they would start rumors using fake radio stations and get American-friendly locals to stage fake attacks on the base, starting riots in the surrounding area. Another proposed part of the plan was to blow up a US ship and blame it on Cuba. This was specifically called out as a, quote, remember the Maine incident, referencing the sinking of an American warship in Cuba in the late 1800s that the US used to justify intervening in Cuba back then to fight the Spanish. This is often thought of as a planned sabotage to justify the intervention. And here was the US military in the 60s at it again. The document predicts that the newspapers would start reporting on the casualties, causing a helpful wave of national indignation. They also wanted to create a fake terrorist campaign on American soil in Miami or Washington. They wanted to sink boats of Cuban refugees and stage the shooting of refugee targets, and even suggested exploding a few plastic bombs in American cities. These weren't all going to be pretend. They even say in the document that they would go to the extent of wounding people and then making fake arrests with prepared documents so it could all be widely publicized, making Cuba look like an irresponsible government worthy of American intervention. They thought through having American Air Force pilots fly over places like Nicaragua and drop bombs on cane fields to burn them down using weapons from the Soviet Union. But for this to work, they would have to be flying Cuban military-style aircraft. They would need to ensure that their planes were properly painted. They would also use these planes to harass American civilian aircraft, making it look like it was the Cubans doing this. They planned a fake hijacking of commercial planes to blame the Cuban government, or to fake shooting down a civilian airliner. And if that wasn't enough, the Joint Chiefs planned to create an incident which will make it appear that communist Cuban jets have destroyed a U.S. Air Force aircraft while it was flying over international waters in an unprovoked attack. Operation Northwoods was a reckless plan to lie and hurt people, proposed by top government leaders who were more and more desperate to invade Cuba.
and they wanted to move fast. They say in just a few months. They needed to do this so that this attack wouldn't involve the Soviet Union, who still hadn't established any defense pact or military bases in Cuba. So what we're looking at here is the increasing desperation of the US military to achieve its goal, to solve the Cuba problem. If JFK would just approve this plan, then the military would get to work, blowing things up, attacking their bases, and terrorizing the American people. But he rejected it. Operation Northwoods never happened. JFK's rejection of this plan is one reason that there was a rift between him and the military, with the military wanting to take a hard line on Cuba and JFK feeling the sting of the Bay of Pigs invasion, thinking that something like this was too much of a risk. A month later, another document came to him, the Joint Chiefs following up with another memo saying that the only way to remove the communist regime was military intervention by the United States, and that Cuba was a vital base of operations for espionage, sabotage, and subversion against other countries in the region. The fear was that communism would spread across Latin America because of this, and time is running out. The rift between JFK and the military continued during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Joint Chiefs hoped to deploy nuclear missiles against the Soviets and invade Cuba, but JFK stood up to the military once again and said no. JFK eventually went on to deny General Lehman Lemnitzer another term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, likely because of his leading role in planning Operation Northwoods. And looking at this bizarre episode in American history, you might feel like this is a moment where our system worked. Military leaders tried to abuse their power to launch an unprovoked and illegal invasion of another country, and the president stopped them. Checks and balances, right? But the reality is, all these men have the same goal. Castro out of power and Cuba under their control again. Their disagreement was one of just a few degrees. The means, not the ends. The reality is that the US was one man, just one person, away from this operation happening, from a full-scale invasion. If JFK had lost the presidency to Nixon, would Operation Northwoods have happened? We can't say conclusively, but it certainly raises the probability. But what's more startling is that, outside of a few norms and some ideas about government, nothing fundamentally has changed in our government. The political military machine still runs on the same software it did in the 60s. If the US government felt like it, and had a big enough enemy, a big enough threat to American interests, it could happen again.
If you want to seal the border, vote Trump. If you want to restore law and order in this country, vote Trump. If you want to defeat the deep state, vote Trump.
Johnny.
Hey, Pachi.
I'm having a really hard time wrapping my head around this story, I must admit.
And this concept of deep state has been so, I think, poisoned by politics and Trump sort of using it for everything that he doesn't like. And it kind of makes it hard to approach it earnestly. But I think we have to keep digging. Like, think there's something here.
Is the deep state real?
Is the deep state real? There's this moment in the 60s where you really see how this actually works, where power really is. It's at the height of this moment where the US and the Soviet Union are in this massive staring contest. There's nuclear weapons involved. Everyone thinks the entire globe could be wiped out in this conflict. And Cuba is centered right in the middle of it all, right off the coast of the US, but they're on the Soviet side of the conflict. The US at this point wants nothing more than to snatch Cuba, to make it their own, and they've been trying to kill Fidel Castro a million different ways. They're looking for an excuse to invade. And to push back on all of this, the Soviets actually start shipping nuclear weapons to the island. The US has no idea, until one day, a spy plane is flying over the island and they snap this wild photo. I mean, it doesn't look like a wild photo, it just looks like a random field in Cuba. But you zoom in and you see canvas tents, trailers, missile launch equipment. I mean, the US government immediately knows what they're looking at here. The world's most destructive weapons are actually hiding under these tents, ready to launch, sitting right in the United States' backyard, right off their coast. Nuclear war 103 miles away.
Within the past week, Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
It's a crisis, a Cuban Missile Crisis. And one man in Washington, D.C. suddenly has a really difficult decision to make. Everyone around him wants him to invade Cuba, but he's not sure. Okay, but here's the kicker of the whole thing. Instead of stay at work that night and figure out this crisis with his advisors, Kennedy gets in a car and travels across town to a cocktail party. He came here to a house in Georgetown, the home of Joe Alsop, one of the nation's most influential newspaper columnists. It was the eve of nuclear war, and the President of the United States kept his dinner date in Georgetown. And the reason why is because at that party were the people he trusted, the people who really had power in Washington during that time. Most of them lived here, in this neighborhood, many of them side by side, all within a few blocks. William Colby, the Far East chief of the CIA. He would later become the director of the agency. Chip Bolin, a former ambassador to the Soviet Union. Allen Dulles, who, Allen Dulles, where to even start? He's the CIA's longest running director, and he lived right here in Georgetown. Frank Wiesner, one of the founding officers of the CIA. He lived just 6 blocks away. Felix Frankfurter, a Supreme Court justice, just a couple minutes walk away. And Kennedy himself had a house in this neighborhood. The reason JFK kept his date in Georgetown that night was because this is where power in Washington was. On the other side of town from the Capitol building, the seat of American democracy. The decisions were being made here by unelected men who had an immense amount of secret power. These were powerful men who were not elected or accountable. And at this point, they had become drunk on the worst kind of power, the secret sort of power that corrupts, the kind of power that our founders sought to check and balance with all of their founding documents. But here in Georgetown, it had moved beyond anything the designers of the country could have predicted, into a shadowy, separate part of our government, a deep state that was actively blackmailing the Congress and working to undermine the President of the United States, and being horrifyingly successful at it.
Unelected deep state operatives who defy the voters to push their own secret agendas.
You take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you. So even for a practical, supposedly hard-nosed businessman, he's being really dumb to do this.
As far as I know, we don't engage in assassinations and kidnappings and things of that kind.
I do think there have to be serious questions raised about some of the foreign policy blunders that this country has had over the last 20 to 25 years.
There's some truth in the idea that there is an ongoing group of people who continue the work of government as administrations come and go. Is it possible for these entities to go rogue? Absolutely.
Was the agency involved in the kind of domestic surveillance that has been portrayed in the news reports?
My feeling is that it has not.
Okay, I'm doing this. The deep state. Is the deep state real? And if so, what is it?
So, we ready, Nick? We're good. Okay. Sweet. Podgy, are you on the board over there?
I hear we good. Thanks.
Okay, if you can
I
hear
really
us.
want this.
Could you start by introducing yourself, who you are, and what you do, and what your relationship to this topic of the history of the CIA is?
Yeah, so my name's Jefferson Morley. I'm a journalist in Washington. I've been a journalist in Washington for the last 40 years.
In the old days, spy agencies were a war thing. When the US was at war, it would set up an international spy operation to best wage that war. And then when the war was over, they would pare down or totally get rid of the spy agency. The thinking here was that a spy agency took up a lot of resources and threatened civil liberties. A lot of power concentrated into a bunch of unelected people. Worth it during war, not worth it during peace. But then the biggest war of them all came to America's Pacific doorstep, and it changed everything.
And so Roosevelt now has a license, more of a license to do what he wants. And one of the first things he does is consult with a man named Bill Donovan.
Wild Bill, a corporate Wall Street lawyer who was obsessed with the power of intelligence.
Donovan had very strong opinions, and he said, you need a wartime intelligence service. You're going to war.
Wild Bill Donovan would be in charge of the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, a centralized intelligence agency that would be given immense power to do whatever it took to keep our people safe and to keep our team on top. This was the birth of modern intelligence, a euphemism for spying and lying and cheating and deceiving and sneaking and breaking, coercing, dividing, and conquering. No idea was too crazy for the OSS during this time. Like, one OSS psychologist had this idea that Hitler could be demoralized if they just showed him a vast quantity of porn.
Paramilitary operations.
Strapping explosives to a bunch of bats and letting them loose over Tokyo.
Guys skiing into Nazi-occupied Norway.
Making fake companies, recruiting off Wall Street from all of his old colleagues, bringing in bankers and movie directors, fake radio stations, anything to demoralize, divide, or confuse the enemy.
The OSS is the first intelligence agency that the United States ever has.
Oh, and one of Wild Bill's favorite things to do was to have parties at his house.
Hi! Are we the first ones here?
It's the big night.
To plan and plot his operations with his friends in Georgetown, a neighborhood in Washington, D.C. that is strikingly beautiful. Here is Bill Donovan's house. It's now worth $17 million. It's beautiful, and this is where he would have a drink and chat with other Washington power brokers. He would recruit new agents from American high society, earning the agency the nickname Oh So Social. Pretty clever. Okay, but remember that spy agencies like this were a war thing only, and the war ended in 1945, and the OSS got dissolved.
The forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations.
What do we do with the OSS now that we're at peace? And Truman says, we don't want to risk having an American Gestapo.
A political police.
His meaning, especially in the context of having just defeated the Nazis, was, that's what led our enemy astray. They had a secret intelligence agency, the Gestapo, which wound up enforcing political norms and enforcing tyranny. And we don't want to risk that.
Here's Harry Truman doing the right thing and signing a piece of paper that says that the OSS can no longer exist. I mean, Truman was freaked out. He's like, this was really great to help us win the war, but this is way too much power in the hands of unelected officials holding secret information. But it was kind of too late. Putting the genie back in the bottle would prove to be an impossible task. Is it significant that all these guys live 4 blocks from each other in Georgetown?
Yeah, it's very significant because they're the product of this wartime culture.
This is one party that just has to turn out right.
Here is target number 1 for the Reds. And who's in the bullseye? You are.
So there was a brief moment after World War II when the Cold War didn't exist. We were at peace. But then, almost immediately, tension started to rise between these two great empires that had been allies to defeat the Nazis, but were now skeptical of each other. And senators were suddenly declaring that it was impossible to know where war begins and where it ends.
The Soviet Union and its agents have destroyed the independence and democratic character of a whole series of nations in Eastern and Central Europe.
And this is when all the intel people that had run the OSS, many of them who lived in Georgetown, by the way, start calling for the resurrection of the OSS, a centralized intelligence agency that we can use to fight this new global war with the Soviet Union. But no, say a bunch of other lawmakers, the Constitution wasn't designed for us to put so much power in the hands of men who are doing secret things. Doing this will result in a police state run by power-grabbing bureaucrats. Too much power to military leaders and their insatiable appetite for more money, for more men, and more power, whatever the cost to democracy.
Truman's mind changed. And what changed Truman's mind was the growing confrontation with the Soviet Union.
And soon the papers were signed and a new agency was formed, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA.
When Truman signs the National Security Act, he says, we have to be careful that we don't have an American Gestapo. So that thought is still on his mind.
The CIA was the big, shiny new weapon of the United States in the Cold War. And their mission was to, quote, gain and distribute intelligence and to perform, quote, other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting national security. What does that mean?
Everybody knew what that language meant. Everybody knew that was, and we just weren't going to talk about it because we didn't want to write it down on paper.
Like, what do they do with this vague mandate of national security?
Oh boy, they go to town.
You must stir the ingredients in your chocolate cake.
It feels so clean, but so soft and smooth.
Operation Paperclip, 1945 to 1959. The Americans wanted to get those Nazi rocket scientists on their side so that they could develop their own rocket capacity. James Angleton, for example, protects a general under Hitler.
CIA gets involved in the Italian
elections, 1948. His thumb on the Italian democracy and makes sure that U.S. allies win.
Operation Ajax, coup in Iran, 1953.
The CIA and the MI6 organize a coup to overthrow the democratically elected government.
Now that we encourage the Shah to take that action, I will not deny.
CIA coup Guatemala, 1954. Bananas, of course, bananas.
Again, democratically elected government, reformists wanted to engage in land reform, and the CIA overthrows it, really at the behest of the United Fruit Company.
CIA is now helping American corporations.
The influence of American corporations on the CIA actions is unmistakable. Allen Dulles was on the board of directors. Howard Hunt, Birch O'Neill, David Phillips, CIA coup in Congo, early 1960s, CIA coup in Chile, 1973.
Good luck, Vegas.
The assassination operation against General Schneider in 1970 is coordinated with Kissinger's office.
Thank you. Nice to see you all.
Mind control experiments, MK Ultra.
In 1950, the CIA launches a massive program to develop means of controlling people's minds. Some 40 U.S. academic institutions were involved in this kind of
LSD
research.
to people without their permission.
Can we develop a truth serum, dosing somebody with LSD 60 times in a week? NSA's Operation Shamrock, electronic surveillance, 1945 to 1975. The first warrantless wiretapping.
Oh God, Bay of Pigs, nightmare.
There were hundreds of CIA assassination plots.
Operation Phoenix.
Eventually, Bill Colby, who was later director, admitted that they had killed 20,000 people.
Operation Mockingbird,
COINTELPRO,
Operation Chaos, Watergate, Jim Critchfield, Frank Wiesner, James Angleton, Roosevelt, John Foster Dulles,
CIA coup in Indonesia, CIA coup in Greece, CIA involvement in the Guatemalan Civil War. It was a CIA crime spree for 20 years. There's no other way to describe it.
So by the 1970s, the CIA is this powerful, well-funded machine of intelligence that is doing a lot of secret things all around the world. They start blackmailing lawmakers to scare them away from investigating them and reining them in.
These agencies had harmful personal information on lots of people. When I was doing my Angleton book, a guy told me one day when he went to meet Angleton, Angleton quoted back to him what he had said to his wife in bed the night before. And so they had this capacity, and people knew that they had this capacity. You know, the Kennedys knew that J. Edgar Hoover had information about his affairs with various women.
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
This kind of knowledge that they had, Angleton and Hoover were masters at using those kind of secrets as leverage. Kennedy had this thing hanging over his head, and he knew Hoover, had that on him. And so, he couldn't fire Hoover.
And so much of this power is concentrated among just a few people, many of them not elected, and many of them living right here along these streets in this neighborhood of Georgetown, living in fancy homes, having fancy cocktail parties, and kind of running the Western world. It's exactly the nightmare of the founders of the country and the nightmare of President Truman.
And 1 month after the assassination of President Kennedy, Harry Truman publishes an article in the Washington Post and says the CIA should be abolished.
Wow.
And he says it has cast a shadow on the historical reputation of the United States.
The man who signed the piece of paper that created the CIA comes out and says he regrets it. Eventually, Americans start to get savvy to the fact that their government is sort of going off the rails. As this war in Vietnam drags on, more and more Americans stand up and say enough, demanding accountability for a national security apparatus that had gotten out of control. And what does the government do in response? they start spying on the protesters.
Operation Chaos was the CIA spying on the anti-war movement. Johnson calls in Dick Helms and says, what's going on? Communists have to be behind this. And so they start infiltrating the anti-war movement. And they come back in about a year and they say, well, Moscow and the North Vietnamese, they really like this anti-war movement, but it's not controlled by them. It's not funded by them. It's pretty much an American thing, But that doesn't change anything. And chaos continues to grow. And eventually, by 1970, there's 30 officers working on it, hundreds of agents. And, the ostensible purpose of chaos, to detect a foreign hand, chaos was in existence for 7 years. Every time they were asked to report on it, they came back and said, it's not foreign controlled and it's not foreign funded, which was obvious to anybody who was involved in the anti-war movement. There were a lot of people inside the CIA saying, we're spying on our wives and kids, basically. They're going to the demonstrations and we're reading the reports at night. We shouldn't be doing this.
Are we trying to exterminate an entire people? What have we become as a nation?
Americans were waking up to the fact that these unelected men were wielding way too much power and spying not only on the entire world, but on Americans themselves.
Been victimized by excessive secrecy, not only with respect to the failure of the Congress in the past to exercise proper surveillance over intelligence activities, but also excessive secrecy has created this kind of mischief within the executive branch.
Senator Frank Church helped lead the charge of taking all of these secrets and excesses and thrusting them onto the national stage and shining a light on them.
There has never been a full public accounting of FBI domestic intelligence operations.
The American people are learning, for the first time, just how bad this was. 800 witnesses, 10,000 documents. Their secrets were shared. CIA, FBI, NSA, assassination plots.
Does this pistol fire the dart?
Yes, it does, Mr. Chairman.
When it fires silently?
Almost silently, yes.
Spying on Americans.
A wholly comprehensive listing of everything those people thought or did on any subject you can imagine they're having a concern with.
Targeting people like Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights or feminist activists.
Bureau agents were told to attack the New Left by disinformation and misinformation.
Anti-war protesters were spied on, intimidated.
COINTELPRO is the name for the effort by the Bureau to destroy people and to destroy organizations, or as they use the words, disrupt and neutralize. The Bureau went so far as to mail anonymous letters to Dr. King and his wife. King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do it. You are done.
That was taken by Dr. King to mean a suggestion for suicide, was it not?
That's our understanding, Senator.
The CIA's LSD mind control experiments were also detailed to the public.
One of the first things they come across is the MK-Ultra papers.
And so were the FBI and CIA's attempts to infiltrate the free press, planting journalists within our newspapers. We would later learn in some investigative reporting that this infiltration of the free press was much more widespread than Church even discovered.
He reported that up to 400 journalists had been paid by the CIA under Operation Mockingbird, and there's no doubt that it was a massive effort and effective.
The Church Committee made a few things clear. Number one, that indeed a group of unelected government employees used immense power and resources of the United States government to pursue programs that were illegal, unethical, and generally out of line with American values and norms. And they did it in secret, outside of any sort of accountability, partly because the U.S. Congress wanted to give them money and turn a blind eye.
I can recall members of Congress who recoiled from responsibility of knowing what was happening. Members of Congress who said, "Don't tell me, I don't want to know." I think that is an indictment of the Congress, just as severe as any indictment which is labeled against any of the intelligence community.
When Dulles wanted to get approval for the CIA budget, all he had to do was take a top line number to the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee And he would say, this is what we want for this year. And the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee would say, okay, that's what you've got, and please don't tell us anything about what you're doing with it. And so there was no internal challenge to this world of CIA people.
But here's the other thing that is so crucial here, which is that when you listen to these hearings, you see people who thought they were doing the right thing, who thought that they were doing what they needed to protect the country during a very scary time.
After a 30-year period, all of a sudden you woke up one morning and here was this creature that had been created that no one along the line had ever really contemplated. Each of these steps, I think, initially were innocent, honest steps.
Many of these agents were earnest patriots, but they were operating in a system free of accountability and transparency.
Even within the deep state, there are people who are doing things for altruistic and good reasons, and then there are people who are doing things for their own selfish or bad reasons, and exactly how many are in each category is sort of impossible to delineate.
I got sucked in when I should have known better, and where many other more intelligent, sophisticated people got sucked in other areas.
So after the Church Committee, all kinds of new oversight regulations come in. There's new committees formed, there's new regulations, and suddenly the intelligence community now finally has some kind of oversight. The deep state was reined in. Now, they did fight back. Church was undermined and intimidated by these agencies.
CIA people, they hated Frank Church. Jim Angleton would go around and say Frank Church was a KGB agent. Dick Helms raged against him. Kissinger. They couldn't believe that U.S. intelligence was being opened up. On the other hand, Americans were like, oh my God, this is what was being done in our name.
But overall, this is a story of American democracy doing what it's supposed to do, rein in the worst impulses of humans with power, and in the process, avoiding disaster, at least for a few decades.
One of you is about to be elected the leader of the single most powerful nation in the world. Have you formed any guiding principles for exercising this enormous power?
When it comes to foreign policy, that'll be my guiding question. Is it in our nation's interests? Peace in the Middle East is in our nation's interests. Having a hemisphere that is free for trade.
Now some very, very sketchy details reaching us here at Sky Centre, important enough to bring to you
A new threat. And a new call to give power to professional spies and bureaucrats to keep us safe by doing secret things.
And by passing the Patriot Act, we will make America safer while safeguarding our civil liberties and privacy.
And then, of course, new agencies, all with variations on the same name.
9/11 is kind of like a Pearl Harbor. There's this desire, we've been attacked, anything goes, we have to strike back. This is an existential struggle. And that same ethos of the early Cold War, anything goes, that returns big time after 9/11. And the CIA seeks or asserts, without being checked, all sorts of powers that they hadn't asserted before. They implement the torture program. They massively expand the warrantless wiretapping, the kind of things that we had seen Angleton do in Chaos. Those exact same techniques are revived and expanded after 9/11, on a very large scale.
Taxpayers funneling money into millions of new top-secret jobs. 22 Capitol buildings worth of new office space that spring up all around this area where I live to house all these new secrets. And inside them, waterfalls of new programs, so many weirdly named programs that no one leader could ever hear about, let alone regulate all of them.
There's not a whole lot of effective oversight on something that has grown so big and so bushy.
And none of which should be known to the public. That is, until someone who's worried that history is repeating itself decides to spill the beans.
Our breaking news this evening is the identity of the man who sent the Obama administration into defend and explain mode this week. His name is Edward Snowden. He's an American former CIA employee and computer technician. Today he came out as the leaker of classified NSA documents that spell out a secret...
And we all kind of wonder, what if we actually need this now? What if we need all these dark windows and top secret PowerPoint decks where they design how they're going to spy on us? What if our safety relies on what happens inside of all these buildings? So we keep funding them. But in doing so, we must at least acknowledge what we're doing here. We are trading a portion of our freedom in exchange for a sense of security. And in the process, we're creating and feeding kind of a new branch of our government power. One that operates outside of this elegant triangle that the founders constructed to trip up the corrupting forces that run the risk of always possessing men with secret power.
Most everybody agrees that there's overclassification. There's way too much information that's classified, but information is power, and the fewer people that have it, the more power the people that do have it have.
And the result is that when the most powerful man in the world arrives to the most powerful house in the world, promising to rein all of this in, to rein in the excesses, he actually finds that he can't. He's not able to change much of it. Instead, he sits there and watches much of the things that he critiqued grow under his watch. The thing that he's supposed to control, he finds he doesn't have that much control over.
These targeted strikes against al-Qaeda terrorists are indeed ethical and just.
Secrets keep us safe, but secrets also degrade this delicate thing that we have called democracy and accountability. That is, until we save ourselves from their everlasting, seductive pull.
We're ready to go up the hill, up the mountain, to glimpse the elusive Area 51 with our own eyes.
When did you see your first disc?
The first disc I saw, I believe it was the second, or I think it was the third time I was up there. We came out and I saw the disc in the hangar. Upon seeing it, it struck me that, well, this explains all the UFO sightings, that this must have been some advanced form of fighter that we've been working on for years, and people have just caught it being tested, so on and so forth.
We're driving basically to the backside, is that right?
This side is really a cliff, and you're going up from the backside.
I see. Johnny is a crazy driver. Dude, with this Jeep, I feel like I'm impervious. That is making me a little anxious. We are arriving to Rachel, Nevada, which I looked at on the map and I was like, oh, it's like a little city. It's not a city. It's like a little settlement in the middle of nothing. Hear the sound. Wow. Oh, yeah, it's just up there freaking cruising. Turning left and right. Here's another one. Look at this thing. Look at this thing turn. Look at that. Oh my god. Look, it just made a 90-degree turn. Just whoop. Who is in that plane right now? Did you see that 90-degree?
Dude, that looked insane.
Look at where we are right now. Here next to what was once a lake, deep in the vast desert of Nevada. During World War II, the military took over huge amounts of land out here. They eventually used it to test weapons, nuclear weapons. If you were in Las Vegas in the 40s and 50s, sometimes you could see these tests in the distance. Then, in the 1950s, the newly created CIA had a secret project they wanted to work on, but they needed a vast tract of land where no one would see them. So they turned to the desert of Nevada, and they found this dry lake bed. It would be perfect for a runway. The CIA, a spy organization, was building an airplane.
Back in the 1950s, the chief adversary of the West was the Soviet Union, and that was a closed society. So it was not easy to find out what their military strength was, their order of battle. It was deemed that overhead reconnaissance would be the way to go.
The result was this. This is a super strange aircraft. It's called the U-2, and the thing flies high, like super high.
In the 1950s and 60s, your average airliner would be flying up 30,000, 40,000 feet. For the U-2, reaching altitudes above 60,000 feet, above 70,000 feet was truly impressive.
What does it look like when you're 70,000 feet above the Earth's surface?
From 70,000 feet, you can easily see the curvature of the Earth. It's almost like being in outer space.
So it's the 1950s and the CIA is secretly in the business of making spy planes. And they're using the U-2 to spy on the Soviets from high, high above, outside the reach of Soviet radar and missiles.
Military bases, infrastructure, intercontinental ballistic missile sites, rocket testing, cosmodromes where space rockets were being launched, the submarine pens, the Navy, all of the Soviets' assets were studied.
The CIA was able to keep their base in the desert secret. Once the U-2 was successfully flying, they packed up and shut it down. It had fulfilled its purpose. But this base would be back soon, and eventually the entire world would know about it.
Okay, we're meeting Jorg. Hello, hello.
Oh, hey, how are you?
Good, nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you. Come on in.
Thank you, thank you.
Not very many people move into the middle of the desert, for their interest and passion. What brought you here?
Well, like many tourists, I came up here for what was supposed to be a day trip. I learned that Area 51 is a real base in the Nevada desert, that you can go to the perimeter and visit it, so I had to see it. So I fell in love with the desert, and I fell in love with the mystery of Area 51. That's almost 27 years ago now.
Wow. Did you have a open-mindedness towards the extraterrestrial narrative?
I was open to UFOs, military, a CIA base where they keep hardcore prisoners. Who knows what all the conspiracy theories are about Area 51. And then through my own research and through communication with other like-minded, I very quickly got in the right direction and learned what Area 51 is about and what it's not about.
The owner of a website devoted to the Area 51 military base wants to know why federal agents busted down the doors to search 2 of his homes.
They busted through my fence line. They broke the door to my house. I heard hollering, "Jörg Arnoux, this is the FBI, we have a search warrant." Wow. A bunch of guns drawn, pointed at me, a riot shield, people with helmets on, with bulletproof vests, full riot gear on.
So what is the major fear? That it was some sort of espionage effort?
They thought that I was a hardcore spy, apparently, spying on the base, maybe even for a foreign government. Who knows what they were led to believe. None of that is true. I'm a guy who runs a website.
We're now learning Area 51, America's capital city for UFO sightings, is apparently real.
The reports even include a map saying the site was merely a testing location for aerial surveillance programs.
As we pass this little hill here, we're passing one of the road sensors. And right now that sensor blip sends out a little data blip to the base. Hey, there's somebody coming. Yeah, that's security.
So, it's the 50s, the U-2 spy plane is flying high over the Soviet Union, successfully evading detection and collecting intelligence of all kind. Everything was going smoothly.
Until 1960, when Frank Powers got shot down.
It's the Hall of Columns in Moscow, scene of many a previous Russian trial.
Hey, we've got your pilot, and he's talking.
And now, Francis Gary Powers, pilot of the American U-2 spy plane shot down over Russia, faced the judges with composure.
Of course, they had the wreckage of the airplane, its sensors and cameras as well, so the game was up. The CIA knew there had to be a replacement for the U-2.
The CIA headed back to the desert of Nevada to try again. This time, they would actually be building this up to be a permanent base and testing facility.
That construction project was called Project 51, and subsequently the base became named Area 51.
To replace the U-2, they developed and started testing a series of aircraft that were on a whole other level.
Orders of magnitude more advanced than other aircraft of its time.
These secret aircraft could fly 5 times faster than the U-2, 20,000 feet higher. Pilots had to wear full pressure suits, basically space suits. It was a marvel of human engineering, and yet only a handful of people on Earth even knew that this was happening.
This was an aircraft that could cruise at Mach 3 speeds. That's 2,100 miles per hour, faster than a speeding bullet.
Now these things look weird on the runway, but they can look even weirder when they're in the sky.
People back in the 60s would be blown away by the spectacle of this unusual shape. It still looks futuristic, even today.
But UFO sightings persist, and skeptics often become confirmed believers.
I saw two red lights, and I saw what looked to be shaped like a pie. I could just see the front of it, and I just saw the round front, and I could see the lights on either side. And then the red light was sort of casting a glow over the whole thing, so it looked like a round disc.
What are you looking at?
A flying saucer? This is the real thing, Conrad.
You believe in UFOs?
Personally, no, sir.
The CIA was able to keep Area 51 secret, but they had a hard time hiding these massive, otherworldly aircraft. Soon, air traffic control towers and pilots and the military itself were seeing things in the sky that they did not understand, that didn't seem possible. And remember, almost everyone in the military and even the CIA didn't know about this.
How do you know that you're not being used? How do you know that you know the full story when you
Everything is highly compartmentalized. Some of them have to have a deep knowledge of what the program's about. Others only need to know certain things in order to do their specific jobs. It's all tightly controlled.
The CIA knows that their high-altitude aircraft are causing a, quote, unexpected side effect, a tremendous increase in reports of UFOs. They conclude that during this time, over half of the UFO sightings are attributed to these spy planes they're testing at Area 51. But strangely, they didn't see this as a problem. In fact, they kind of embraced it, secretly feeding the rumors that these could be extraterrestrial visitors. One engineer called the UFO sightings a, quote, bonus, a useful distraction for a program that, in order to remain useful, must remain secret. But the CIA also used the rise of UFO sightings to study human behavior, to use the public as their guinea pig, testing how mass perception can be shaped and manipulated.
I absolutely do believe that there is a PSYOPs program going on where they want to throw something out there and see what comes back. How do people react to it? I know from stories that I've been told from people that have worked at Area 51 many, many years ago that they would actually put on light shows for the benefit of people to just kind of further this UFO myth. They want to confuse people that come out here and may actually see something that they are not supposed to see, and at the same time test their new stuff. And how do people react to it? I absolutely think there is a lot of stuff going on that most military personnel have no concept of, and that they are subjected to as guinea pigs, if you will.
But soon the Soviets caught up, and even these planes that could fly so fast and so high couldn't fly over the Soviet Union undetected. So here at Area 51, the attention turned from developing and testing these planes that could fly fast and high to testing aircraft that could disappear altogether.
So this is really the back gate of Area 51, but today it is the most known gate of Area 51, very heavily fortified. Back in the late 90s, there was a cattle fence here, a little guardhouse, that was it. And you know, as more tourists come here, they feel the need for more security. So we got a double gate here. Don't go past the gate. This is probably as far as we want to go.
Okay, we are at the back gate. Here it is. It's quiet. Barbed wire. We've got some cameras looking at us right now. No drones. I will respect that. So there's a new radio tower right there, and it apparently is transmitting a radio signal that you can tune into. It is a part of an experimental program to use radio waves from like civilian radio stations to see things in the air. Passive radar is this technology. It's existed for a while, but anyway, if you tune into the right frequency, you can hear what they're playing at their radio station in Area 51. Not for people to listen to, but to test radar and aircraft.
Oh, come on.
That's it. This is it.
That's it.
my God, this is amazing. If you go through this gate and walk that way, you will get to the highly secretive base where they are testing things. What is going on over those mountains?
It is about 10 or 12 miles to the turn of the Tickeroo from here.
Solos are so good. Got the wah-wah pedal going. So we are now headed to the peak, the one place where you can look into Area 51. It is a mountain, a peak up there. It's going to require a bit of a hike, some off-roading, but it is the one vantage point where you can look down and see Area 51. So that is our goal, and we are off on that mission right now.
We are in the midst of a global communications explosion.
So by the late 1970s, the CIA was trying to get out of the aircraft business.
They had satellites to do their spying with. And in fact, a satellite accidentally photographs Area 51. Something they weren't supposed to do. Whisperings of a secret airstrip in the Nevada desert are getting out. Area 51 was now under control of the Air Force, not the CIA. And they set about trying to make their planes invisible to radar. Not by flying high, but by designing them in these strange shapes. If you want to make your aircraft invisible to your enemy, you have to trick their radar, the main tool that they use to look at you. These radar are constantly pumping out invisible radio waves into the sky. If nothing's there, the waves will just keep going. But if a plane is flying by, the radio waves will hit the plane and bounce back to this dish that captures and records that signal, that radar signature. It's able to detect how big the object is, how far away it is, how fast it's moving. This is how you get eyes on enemy aircraft flying in your airspace.
We've moved into an age where stealth became more prevalent.
So how do you trick this system? You have to mess with those waves, get them to bounce off somewhere else, absorb them, scatter them, so that they barely make it back to the radar, which is how you get this. A full-scale model of a plane that they were designing, and radar scattered everywhere, shooting radio waves at this plane, collecting data on how big the radar signature is, and hoping that those radio waves aren't bouncing back to this dish. That's what these strange angles are for. The Air Force would even get their hands on enemy radar systems to see how well they could measure these stealthy planes.
There's a huge array of adversary radars that are used to measure the radar signatures of different aircraft.
And the designs just kept getting wilder and wilder.
The early stealth planes looked like they were from out of this world. I think it's likely that many of the things that have been tested there, if they were seen out of their context by someone who wasn't witting of the program, could easily just take it for a UFO.
And unlike the planes developed earlier at Area 51, these carried weapons. So soon, they were used in combat.
The F-117A, known as the Nighthawk or the Stealth Fighter, became the star of Operation Desert Storm.
By the 1980s, Area 51 had become the ultimate test laboratory for the US to remain the dominant air power on Earth, and secrecy was the key ingredient for keeping it that way. But secrecy has a byproduct. It kills trust. It produces speculation.
Well, there's several, actually 9 flying saucers, flying discs, that are out there of extraterrestrial origin.
Great, thanks.
Just go straight from here and follow the directions.
Okay, thank you so much.
This is it.
I really appreciate everything.
Good luck, guys.
Yeah.
And shoot me a text when you get up there. Make sure so I can know that you guys got up there okay.
Absolutely, we will.
If you get in trouble, call me, I'll bail you out.
We are on our own. Jorg is awesome. Website, his project is just like his passion, and I am such a fan of him and his approach to all of this. All right, now we got to navigate through some gnarly roads. I got this offline GPS situation, and we are going to try to make our way to that peak so we can glimpse the elusive Area 51 with our own eyes.
On Capitol Hill today, a bipartisan call for more government transparency on UFOs, or as the military calls them, unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs. 3 retired military veterans testified before a House subcommittee. One was asked about alien bodies. 2 others talked about seeing UAPs.
You've stated that the government is in possession of potentially non-human spacecraft. Do you believe our government has made contact with intelligent extraterrestrials?
It's something I can't discuss in public setting.
This is more adventure than I expected.
Listen. You hear a rumble. You hear it all the time around here. Oh boy. Okay, we are at over 7,000 feet, which is about 2,200 meters maybe. The air is a little thinner. Things are getting steep and rugged and beautiful. I mean, there's a stunning view of the valley. We're definitely gaining a lot of elevation here. I think that's the top right there. That's the top. It better be the top. I better be laying my eyes on Area 51 in like 20 feet. Let's do this. Woo. It's gonna be worth it.
Look at these guys.
We made it! We are on the top of Tikaboo Peak. We did it. This is sick. This is so sick. There's a rumble of sound.
It's there, you see it? Those buildings, I think.
Oh yeah, there it is, yes. We are going to get the big long lens out, see if we can point it at Area 51. That is Area 51. You can't see it very well because the sun is setting in it. It's backlit. Look up, look up. Look at that fire just cruising. Nice.
He's doing a show for us. That's a tight turn, man.
Wow. Yeah, they're doing some practice.
The United States has unveiled its latest stealth bomber at a ceremony in California.
The B-21 is named in honor of airmen who carried out the surprise World War II Doolittle raid. It can carry both nuclear and conventional weapons.
We are again making it plain to any potential foe. The risk and the cost of aggression far outweigh any conceivable gains.
We're just surrounded by jets doing crazy maneuvers. I mean, I've never been a military guy, but there's a little boy inside of me right now being very much in awe of these machines up there. Yeah. And the people sitting inside of them who may or may not actually be humans. These may be AI controlled or remote controlled somehow. So who knows? But dude, that thing turning looks so crazy. This is so fun.
We've got a scanner in case there's some activity tonight. We will hear it. We're gonna set up camp here, get some dinner started.
We are going to place them. We're gonna line up. I think this goes on top.
Okay. This is where we'll be sleeping tonight. Area 51 is right there. Janet will be taking off soon. By the way, when I say Janet, I'm referring to one of these planes that flies between Area 51 and Las Vegas every day, bringing employees to and from the base.
As the operation at Watertown grew in scope, more transportation was required.
5 minutes. Will we get Janet taking off into the sunset?
Boy, do we have the lens that would, if it is possible,
with Podgy as the operator. This is such a surreal moment. It is like desolation and then desert, and then it's the most sophisticated aircraft technology that humans have ever invented.
Oh, I think it's taking off.
Oh,
see the jet.
Oh,
Yeah.
Did you get a glimpse of it?
I have it. I'm recording it.
Oh, dude. Janet. There goes Janet to Las Vegas.
36 Whiskey 7000, climbing to 15,000. We're doing a turn to Bugsy here on Safari. Changing the cruise. Good play, good night. Good night, Janet. 86 Whiskey. See you later.
I took this time lapse while we were sleeping in this tent because I wanted to see if there was any activity on the base while we were sleeping. And sure enough, at around 3:26 in the morning, boom, right there, you'll see that the base lights up. These are the runway lights that come alive here at 3 in the morning at Area 51. Here it is, they're off, and then boom, they turn on. Now we're fast asleep at this point, but what this represents is a moment in time where the base comes alive, probably so that they can test something, so that people like us who are watching from the one place you can see Area 51 can't see anything. And sure enough, here in these photos, I don't see anything take off. Photo by photo, whatever took off, if anything, did so very discreetly. I'm looking real closely. Oh, keep in mind, this is taking a photo every 30 seconds. So at one point during this moment, you see a little green fleck right there, which could be something, I don't know. And then it goes away. Green fleck goes away. All of this is a reminder that Area 51 is an Air Force base that is doing what it's been doing for a lot of years, which is testing secret new technology. And that for most of its history, this place was not associated with UFOs or aliens. That's kind of a new thing.
That didn't happen until about 1989.
Former government scientist has alleged that the U.S. military is flying recovered UFOs at a secret base in the Nevada desert. The allegations about the secret facility near the Groom Mountains first surfaced on Eyewitness News last Friday.
Well, there's several, actually 9 flying saucers, flying discs, that are out there of extraterrestrial origin.
Scientist Bob Lazar says there are at least 9 of the flying saucers being tested and that they were not built on Earth.
I got to look inside and it had really small chairs and things began to click together just all too fast. Yeah, it's obvious it came from somewhere else other than Earth.
Lazar claimed that all of this extraterrestrial technology was being researched in a secret facility south of Area 51.
Bob Lazar's claims are the root of the modern fascination with Area 51. News media and tourists descending on the remote parts of the desert in Nevada to see flying saucers.
Did you see that move it did?
No, I didn't.
It went like it went wow, look how bright it's getting. Look at it now. It came up above the same mountain. It moved around. It did a step move. It actually went up in the air like this and hovered.
The Lazar story happened at the beginning of the internet really burgeoning, and people all across the world will know what you're talking about if you say Area 51. But the first thing they're going to think of is flying saucers.
Area 51. Officially, the government won't even admit it exists.
Take my word for it. There's no Area 51. That's not entirely accurate.
Where conspiracy theorists think the government has aliens on ice.
I mean, I'd love to see, this huge mothership, but anything's fine at this point.
Don't you have UFOs in Germany?
No. There are no reports, according to CNN, of any alien sightings.
The Bob Lazar thing, I wanted to know, first of all, I want to be around him and see if I could smell bullshit.
Did you?
And we also sent people to Area 51 to make sure there were no aliens.
Clinton said he did go right in and he did check, and there was nothing.
That's what we're instructed to say.
It's never been my thing, I have to be honest. I have never been a believer. I have people that Area 51 or whatever it is, I think it's the #1 tourist attraction in the whole country or something.
A Facebook post calling on people to storm Area 51.
It's not clear the 1.1 million Facebook followers who said they are going to storm Area 51 are real.
Okay, it's like 5 a.m., sun's coming up, and we've got a helicopter that is maybe circling around us right now? Definitely circling around us. Yeah. Look at this.
This is freaky.
There it is. I think it's a goner. Wow, that is a weird looking helicopter. It has no lights on. and it just popped over and it kind of just flew around us. And I thought it was just going like somewhere else, but then it started banking around and circling us. And then it just descended deep into this valley and then back to the base. Like it definitely was just a little patrol to be like, hey, good morning guys, we see you. Yeah, so that happened this morning. Podgy, did that freak you out?
A little bit, yeah. It's like, are they gonna like hover over us and be like, get the out of here, or like give us your SD cards?
Yeah, I was getting ready to hide the SD cards. I was like, no, let's not play around with the footage we have. Exciting way to wake up here at 5 a.m. at Area 51. The sun is rising. Soon it will hit the base and we'll get some beauty footage of the base itself. What are you seeing in there?
I'm seeing a bunch of like water towers, a big one in the middle kind of, and then I see this like UFO shaped thing on the right that looks like it's on a pole. It's probably also a water tower, but who knows?
Could just be a flying saucer.
Could just be a flying saucer. Oh yeah, I see the runway now. That's fun.
I got more than 24 people who have come to me with bits and pieces of the story, who had worked out at Area 51 that I confirmed were out there. Security people who had seen a disc under a tarp in a hangar. Different people had worked there at different times, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, who had little pieces of the story. He said that they eventually told me that they had a live alien out there.
Oh yeah, there's a Janet.
I don't believe that they actually have any evidence, because I really don't think there is such a thing as crashed UFOs, all of that.
Yeah, it's taking off. It's going across the frame right now.
The Air Force initially really hated the whole UFO alien connection to Area 51 because it brought a lot of attention and helped shut down the work that they were doing. But eventually they sort of adopted it, kind of got in on the joke, and so now you see a lot of unit and project emblems that feature aliens and flying saucers and things like that, and they've sort of embraced that mythology a little bit.
We're gonna leave our mark here on the little book at the top of Chickaboo Peak where all the people have left their little note. What's our message to the future hikers?
Peace and love.
Peace and love.
Don't drop bombs on people.
Yeah, that's probably a good one, even though they're in the planes that drop the bombs. I came here to the desert to better understand Area 51, but I'm walking away with a deeper understanding of secrecy. Secrecy, especially state secrecy, has an odd psychological weight to it. It draws not just attention, but projection, a custom lens that we all see it through.
I always like to say Area 51 is like a magic mirror. You look at it and you see whatever reflection you want to see.
It activates that old mechanism in our minds that fills in the gap with certainty, a story that helps us make sense of it all. The patriot sees brilliant engineers protecting a free nation. The skeptic sees a militaristic country, arrogant with power. The dreamer sees a gateway to other worlds. The cynic sees a lie so big that it must contain something nefarious, and the believer sees proof of the paranormal. And the curious tourist just sees an opportunity to indulge in a conspiracy theory for a few days, all while picking up some souvenirs and traveling through the beautiful high desert of Nevada. All of us look at the same chain link fence, and all of us see something different. Because they were hiding something here. They are hiding something here.
Secrecy for the last 70 years at Area 51 has been the main objective, and they got it down very well. It's been applied to everything, sometimes to a fault.
And the military and government have fueled rumors to confuse us, to distract us. And herein lies the paradox of secrecy. Secrecy may be essential to national defense, but for an open society, secrecy breeds mistrust, the very thing we need to stay secure and peaceful. Mistrust becomes suspicion, and suspicion becomes belief. And beliefs, once crystallized, are hard to dislodge. What I feel fairly certain of is that the US Air Force will continue to develop and test all kinds of super advanced technology here on this dry lake bed. They'll do this to retain their position as the world's dominant air power. And they're making stuff now that we probably won't learn about for decades. But that part of the story isn't a mirror. The world is much less interested in that,
Because at Area 51, the secrecy is the story. Sometimes bizarre, sometimes dangerous, sometimes beautiful, and nearly always confusing, which I think is exactly what the secret keepers want. Hey, if you're still watching, you are probably somebody who wants to better understand the world. So do the thousands of members of our club called New Press. New Press is where smart, curious people get a deeper version of what we do across all of our channels. In-depth interviews with experts we speak to, conversations between creators, and a place to connect with other members directly. And I just launched a podcast with Iz that only New Press members get access to. Right now it's $60 a year to become a founding member. That money goes directly to support work like this. You can go check it out at newpress.com. The link is in the description, and I'll see you over there. A satellite hurls around the globe at 7.5 kilometers per second. Then it drops a 6-meter rod that starts falling the 400 kilometers towards Earth. No explosives, just speed.
Things like rods from God, which is dropping big tungsten rods from space, having them fall very quickly.
Mach 24 at first, but the atmosphere eventually slows it down to Mach 8. It's still going super fast till it reaches the surface of the Earth. Another satellite waits in orbit for years, and then when given the command, it releases a capsule.
A re-entry capsule with hundreds of drones, thousands of drones. You can put it anywhere you want within a matter of minutes.
Here's a caravan of a dozen satellites. They've got small missiles inside, and they're just waiting till a military commander on Earth gives them the order to go hit a group of enemy satellites, knocking out the vital communication and navigation capabilities of the enemy. These aren't sci-fi scenarios. These are real projects that militaries are working on, powerful militaries. They've been thinking about these things for years, but we're in a new era of space. It's a lot easier to get up here. And so, as happens, countries want to control it.
Now we're getting to the point where these crazy ideas that people would have said were science fiction are becoming more possible. And we should be looking at all these things on the horizon. Advances in space happen very rapidly.
The new military space race is really between the US, China, and Russia, though less and less Russia. This is really a rivalry between the United States and China. Both countries have a relatively new wing of their military dedicated to controlling, defending, and preparing for combat in space, or in the words of the US Space Force, to fundamentally transform our approach to space from a combat support function to a warfighting domain. And it's getting crowded. Lots and lots of satellites are going up there. There are over 12,000 floating around the Earth right now. Oh, and by the way, I've always had a little trouble with these visuals of like all the dots that are satellites. This is not to scale. These satellites are not like right next to bumping into each other. But the fact remains, there's a lot of high-tech stuff floating around our Earth, and more of that is dedicated to military purposes. It's become a vital tool of modern warfare, and that is what this video is about. It's about these devices, satellites, that not only let planes and troops navigate and communicate, but also scan the world looking for missile launches. They reveal secrets, looking through clouds, and at night to capture underground submarine headquarters, deep-sea cable cutters, North Korean warships. I'm going to show you how militaries are working on technology that they could potentially use to attack the satellites of their enemy with grappling hooks, with lasers, with a nuclear bomb. I've been talking to experts, including one that you'll hear a lot from in this video, as I set out to understand war in space. This escalating race to control and dominate a domain shrouded in mystery, one that is hard to police. And it's all happening right at a time when we're entering into an era of global rivalries. They're heating up again. All while the most powerful people on Earth have a deeper and deeper interest in what happens in this space far above our heads. It's space. It's the final frontier, and it's time we start paying attention.
Space, an infinite ocean. For man is not content unless he's pressing himself to the limits of his knowledge or beyond.
Okay, first we gotta talk about satellites. These little computers bolted to a metal frame that are orbiting around our planet.
Some are very small. Some might be referred to as a CubeSat. So a CubeSat is something very small. You can fit it in your hand.
That's Clayton Swope, who
who's an expert on space policy here at a think tank in DC called CSIS.
It could be the size of a refrigerator in a college dorm room. But then you have others that could be the size of a bus. So solar panels will be a lot bigger than the satellite. So think about it, you're just moving your arms out usually, and that's how the satellite looks with solar panels.
Some of these satellites are way far out in this orbit called geostationary orbit. They're a tenth of the way to the moon. And they're moving at the same speed as Earth. So if you were to look at them in the night sky, they would just kind of look like a star. They stay in one place. But most satellites these days are here in this sweet spot of low Earth orbit, about 400 to 800 kilometers above our heads. And look, there's the International Space Station hurling around the Earth. This one's obviously a lot bigger than a refrigerator. And a reminder of something that may be obvious to some of you, but was kind of fuzzy in my head and now it's not, which is that these satellites are not like zooming around the Earth with jet engines. They are actually kind of falling. When a rocket launches a satellite into space, it goes upwards for a few kilometers, but then it starts to go sideways. And in fact, most of the energy being blasted out of this rocket is being used to move it, let's say, horizontally, getting close to 30,000 kilometers an hour.
You're trying to outrace gravity.
And once you're moving that fast, you can cut the engines because you're at this magical speed where you keep missing the Earth.
So you're trying to move so fast while gravity's pulling you in that you are effectively staying in an orbit around the Earth. So you're trying to defeat gravity.
So people who are floating in the International Space Station are not floating because they're not in Earth's gravity. They're floating because they've kind of reached this perfect equilibrium of speed and gravity that makes them constantly falling. So before we get to all the war and defense stuff, let's just take a moment and appreciate this magical thing we've invented called putting things into orbit around our Earth. These days, a lot of these satellites are talking to one another, forming a constellation where they can send signals between each other, all to serve a variety of purposes, like helping guide ships and airplanes, or tracking pollution, or running scientific analysis on crops, or internet. Starlink has around 7,000 of these satellites in a big constellation that provides internet access to remote areas that were very disconnected before, and to those fighting in the war in Ukraine. There's one satellite constellation that I use more than any other, and it looks like this. This is a very special constellation.
The biggest thing that we take for granted is the global positioning system, is GPS.
Around 30 satellites that are flying 20,000 kilometers above us, run by the American government. At any given time, anywhere on Earth, 3 of these satellites can see us. And this signal allows them to provide a very accurate location of where we are on the Earth. If you lock onto 4 satellites, you can even get your elevation. I mean, this is magic. Not to mention, it's all delivered to me on an easy-to-use software like Google Maps that allows me to navigate anywhere in the world. By the way, Russia has their own kind of GPS constellation. So does China and the EU. My other big use case for these satellites is something you've seen me do a lot on the channel. This incredibly high-res photos that we take from space and stitch together to create something like Google Earth. I've spent hundreds of hours on Google Earth, sometimes just for fun, sometimes for work, and I gotta say, it never gets old for me. And it works because a bunch of these satellites have big, advanced cameras on them, like this one. They take high-definition images of our planet, send them back down to Earth with this little antenna. Oh, and these days, it's not just visible light that we're capturing from satellites. Some satellites send out super long waves, like microwave radiation, and then record how it bounces back. This allows them to see through things like clouds. It allows them to see elevation, seismic activity, weather patterns, or maybe a secret nuclear submarine base hidden in a mountain in China, or a missile production facility in a mountain in Iran. So you see where this is going. We have to remember why these things were put up into space in the first place. And the answer is war. It was the 1950s and 60s when space kind of became a war thing. The US and Soviet Union were racing to put satellites in space, not only to flex on each other scientifically, but also to spy on each other from above. Back then, these satellites would have huge rolls of film on board. They would take a bunch of pictures of enemy territory and then eject the canister of film, which would barrel back down into the atmosphere and then be caught in midair by like an airplane, brought back to HQ and developed, and boom, you've got a bunch of pictures of Soviet missile sites. pretty nuts. So this was like the main military application of space. But of course, over the decades, militaries floated some pretty crazy ideas on how to actually militarize space, how to threaten the enemy's satellites. But it was all really difficult and expensive, and eventually the Soviet Union fell, so the threat was like, why are we doing this? But fast forward to today, and two things have happened. The threat is back, and the cost for going to space is down. By 2020, humanity had 3,000 active satellites floating around our planet. And then, right after, the graph says it all. It has become way cheaper to put stuff into space, thanks to the rise of innovative private space companies, most notably Elon Musk's SpaceX. There's so many satellites up there that some astronomers are complaining that when they look up in the night sky, satellites are getting in the way. And this also comes at a time when global rivalries are heating up. So in 2019, the US Congress passed a law that created the United States Space Force, the newest branch of the US military, officially classifying space as, quote, a war-fighting domain, just like the other domains, air, land, sea, and cyber. So let's quickly go over how militaries use space today, how space has become so vital to modern warfare, and then how these countries are preparing to fight war in space. So first up, militaries still use satellites to spy.
Let's just say sensing. So that could be taking pictures of things happening on Earth. So we want to know when a missile gets shot off. We want to see a signal. We want to be able to see a thermal signature. We want to track something. So you could think surveillance or reconnaissance, things like that.
Countries use this imagery to keep an eye on their enemy. Like, look at how far satellite imagery has come in just a few decades. So the US immediately knows if Russia is moving a bunch of troops to the Ukrainian border like they did in February 2022, right before they invaded. And China and Russia know that the US has recently moved a bunch of B-2 bombers onto this tiny island in the Indian Ocean, potentially preparing to bomb Iran. Who knows? But you can't really keep this stuff a secret anymore. Militaries can see each other, and they can see much deeper into each other's worlds. This is how we know so much about the military of North Korea, a notoriously closed place. There are people spending all their time looking at maps of North Korea, spotting things like this concealed submarine. In fact, we're making an entire video exploring what we can learn about North Korea purely from the satellite map imagery. And that's coming out soon, so keep an eye out for it. So now that it's much cheaper to get stuff up into space, you're going to expect to see a lot more of these constellations. More and more like swarms of satellites that can direct their gaze to anywhere on Earth and monitor it in real time. This is something that is actively being worked on, actually. According to some reporting from Reuters, SpaceX was awarded a $1.8 billion contract with the National Reconnaissance Office to develop this spy satellite swarm concept. This stuff will be taking so many photos and feeding back so much data that no one person or group of people is going to be able to sort of process it, which is a perfect time for artificial intelligence to come in. We made a whole video about how AI is transforming war and how huge amounts of data from all these different sensors can be fed in to a command and control software to give intel and even target recommendations to commanders. So that's a whole other video. Okay, so that's spying and sensing, and that's a huge part of the future of how space will be used by militaries. The other is an early warning system. The US, China, and Russia, and to a limited degree other countries like India and France, have satellites to just keep an eye on the missile sites of their enemies, looking for something like this, a missile being launched. These satellites are an early warning system that can tell the people back on Earth that something's coming their way so that they can shoot it down before it gets too close. Now, quick accuracy caveat here. We've had this tech for a really long time, but it's kind of outdated, and it doesn't have the capability to look for like hypersonic missiles and all of these things. So the US has this space development agency that just sent up a new generation of satellites with the vision of creating a big constellation of hundreds of small satellites that surround the globe in low Earth orbit and constantly monitor for the heat signature of a missile launch.
The third thing is GPS, the ability to just know where you are and to have a way to not have to use a map and compass when you navigate.
And then, of course, there's potentially the most valuable thing for any military, which is just communication.
So we want to be able to use space to talk to each other.
So you can see that space for these spacefaring militaries is like a nervous system, an invisible nervous system that gives militaries the ability to see the whole world, to sense it, to communicate between it, and to make decisions. It's a really powerful capability. If your enemy knocks some of these out, the communication, the navigation, that could really hinder your ability to operate in a combat scenario.
When you disrupt those, and we've seen indications of that in Ukraine, munitions don't work right, soldiers don't know where they are, systems just don't know how to work. If you're a Marine on a beach in an island in the Indo-Pacific, you're getting out a map and compass though. You're gonna be storming those shores like your great-grandfathers did in Iwo Jima. It's a very different environment without GPS.
And look, they're just kinda up here. Nothing's really protecting them. And this gets us to the moment of the video that you probably clicked on this for, the weapons. According to a general at the US Space Force, there are already attacks happening in space every single day. The war in space has already begun, but these aren't like boom attacks, kinetic attacks. These aren't like things exploding yet.
It's not just missiles shooting at satellites and blowing up satellites. It's things like GPS jamming and spoofing. That effectively is a way to defeat a space capability. If you can't receive it, you can't use it.
Jamming is a big one, and you can do it from the ground. It's when an attacker uses an antenna to send a super loud radio signal that drowns out the original signal between the satellite and the ground station, so a message can't get through. And then there's spoofing, kind of a silly sounding name, where an attacker sends up a message to the satellite that throws it off course, tells it to do something it's not supposed to. You can render it effectively useless, at least for a time. Jamming and spoofing is very common. We actually know of locations that are doing this, that are committing these types of attacks, that have these capabilities. And then there's lasers. Yes, just as we all imagined when we hear the words space war, there are lasers.
So if it's trying to take pictures of space, if you point a laser at it, that's going to disrupt its ability to do that. So it could be a temporary disruption, or it could be permanent, depending on how strong that laser is.
Then there's good old cyber attacks. Hack into the satellite software by sending malicious code to the satellite. You can either steal the data that's in the satellite, you can stop it from working, you can take control of it temporarily, or you could even just plant a little virus in the satellite and just have it sit there, dormant, until you need to activate it. So again, these are happening all of the time. We saw it in 2022, just an hour before Russia conducted its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They sent a bunch of cyber attacks to the satellites that were providing internet and communications to the Ukrainian troops. It went dark, which again, in a wartime scenario, is a big deal. One Ukrainian official described the attack as, quote, catastrophic. And China is working on an anti-satellite cyber weapon, whose purpose is to, quote, seize control of a satellite, render it ineffective to support communications, weapons, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems. Basically everything a satellite is good for, this Chinese weapon is just gonna kind of wipe it out. Again, you don't have to blow the thing up to make it not useful anymore. Now, there's very little doubt in my mind that the United States doesn't have a similar, if not superior, weapon that does the same thing. We just don't know about it. But at least from my reporting, I haven't seen any evidence of that kind of weapon, but the US probably has one. In 2023, when the Wagner Group attempted a coup in Russia, they first hacked the Russian satellite telecom system. That same year, Chinese hackers attacked Japan's space agency. These are the types of attacks that are happening every day. You need to show your adversary your capabilities. Hey, we can do this, which hopefully avoids an escalation in conflict. But it's also a way of just showing off, projecting power. And in some cases, trying to sabotage the capabilities of your adversary.
The ability to disrupt, maybe not even the satellite, but maybe the ground station, the ground infrastructure, which is just as key to be able to use it. If we can't operate space launch during a conflict, we can't replace satellites that get damaged or destroyed. So a lot of things that don't really look like bombs going off, but they still have a chain that quickly leads to this degradation of our ability to use space when we need it.
And the advantage of all these non-kinetic attacks is that they don't blow anything up and create a bunch of debris, which could hit another satellite and create a cascading effect that could be really, really bad. They are also kind of more subtle, deniable, they're not as escalatory. But the disadvantage is that they are reversible. They don't actually take the system out, they just kind of mess with it for a little bit. Okay, we've arrived to the blowing up part of the video, and I intentionally kind of put it here and didn't make it the full focus because even though it's a kind of like more sensational version of this story, these other capabilities, the non-kinetic stuff, is actually the stuff that's happening right now. It is like the conflict and the war that is currently happening up there, and it's the most likely to continue. But we can't go on without talking about the kinetic stuff because countries are working on it. And in fact, we already have a lot of the capabilities to take out satellites. The first one is to actually just target the ground station. A satellite's not very useful if it can't communicate back down to the surface. Ukraine did this last year in Crimea. They attacked this Russian early warning satellite station. Another is by shooting a missile up into space to hit a satellite, which is something a lot of countries can do already.
So we've seen a lot of countries do that. The US has demonstrated that. We've seen China do it. We've seen India do it.
Now, these aren't countries shooting other people's satellites. It's shooting their own satellites, like decommissioned satellites. It is the thing that you do to deter your enemy by being like, we could blow up your satellite if we wanted to. This creates a lot of debris.
The Russia test was in 2021, and it created debris that was at around the same altitude as the International Space Station.
What the Russians did today with these 1,500 pieces of trackable orbital debris poses a risk not only to those astronauts, not only to those cosmonauts, but to satellites, to the interests of all nations.
Okay, and now we're getting to the kind of cutting edge stuff that we kind of technically can do, but it's like in its early stages, which is the ability for satellites that are up there to attack each other while they're up there. This is not Star Wars where everyone's zipping around and shooting at each other. It's kind of like if there was a bunch of cars driving around a racetrack at like 100 miles an hour. If you want to attack another one, you kind of have to drive up to it and attack it while you're going 100 miles an hour. And put that in 3 dimensions and make it, space, and suddenly you've got satellite co-orbital attacks.
You can maneuver in space. It just doesn't look like airplanes flying in the atmosphere.
So now we're seeing these big militaries develop capabilities to maneuver their satellites around in more and more sophisticated ways.
So China has demonstrated they can put a satellite into geostationary orbit. It was called SJ-21.
It's apparently tasked with cleaning up space junk. So in January 2022, this Chinese satellite starts to break from just the boring old orbit and starts to do some crazy stuff. They start to go 3,000 kilometers up and down from the orbit. They sync up with one of China's dead satellites and they grab onto it with a kind of like grappling hook robotic arm thing. They get back into orbit with the trash in hand, and they eventually push it out into what's called graveyard orbit. I mean, we're looking at this on like an animation, and it looks all simple, and it's like, well, yeah, they just met up, and he grabbed it, and he like threw it away, and like, no, this is insane. Like the physics and the maneuvering and the fuel.
So demonstrating, you could say, the ability to do very sophisticated maneuvers in orbit. No one's done something like that before. Those types of capabilities, those could also serve a military purpose, the ability to grab onto a satellite and move it.
One of the Space Force folks at the Pentagon characterized this as China practicing
dogfighting in space.
Dogfighting meaning like what airplanes do when they fight each other and chase each other and shoot each other down.
They are practicing tactics, techniques, and procedures to do on-orbit space operations from one satellite to another.
So why would they do that? Don't know. They're testing. Are they showing off? Does this go back into the deterrence piece that we talked about earlier? It's hard to say what the messaging is of that, but what it does show is that they're operating in an increasingly sophisticated way in space with their satellites, around their own satellites, but still concerning. And then 2, that they just don't seem to care as much about fuel use as we historically have.
Being able to precisely maneuver to another satellite while you're in orbit doesn't just allow you to grab onto it with this claw machine looking thing. You can also do some other clever military things. For example, Chinese military researchers published a paper specking out a concept for a satellite bomb that you could theoretically deliver into the exhaust pipe of a satellite in orbit and just have it sit there. They're thinking about this stuff. Now, I'm making it sound like China's the only one who has the ability to maneuver. That's not true. The US can do this, and so can Russia even. And in fact, last year, multiple Russian satellites got close to an American spy satellite and kind of surrounded it. The US complained and they eventually backed off, but like there's movement happening up there. One of these Russian satellites even was seen shooting something off. Like it didn't shoot at another satellite, but it shot it off into space. Russia swears this was perfectly peaceful, but...
So you could say like a projectile from Russian satellites. What is that test? Is that a test of an anti-satellite weapon? So effectively a projectile that could shoot from one satellite to another? Is it indicative of some other type of testing? We really don't know. I'm suspicious of anything Russia would be doing like that in low Earth orbit. So I'm thinking weapons test. And even if that's not the intention, I still think that could serve as a weapon.
A lot of these things look like civilian operations that can be used for kind of civilian or commercial purposes. But if things got real down here on Earth, those same capabilities could be flipped to be used as attacking weapons from one satellite to another. Now, the US has not acknowledged whether or not they have any of these kinds of weapons. They have come out and said that they could develop these types of weapons if they wanted to, but they don't acknowledge any programs with co-orbital anti-satellite weaponry. But knowing what we know about this stuff, we can assume, or at least I assume, that the US probably has really sophisticated capacity for satellite-on-satellite attacks. We just don't really know about it. One thing we do know about, kind of, is this puppy. I mean, this thing looks like Space Wars. A little mini space shuttle thing. Much to my disappointment, this thing is not just zipping around in space like in Star Wars. It is also a satellite that is just going around doing the falling through space thing. This space plane is an experimental aircraft that's working on all kinds of crazy new tech, including capturing solar power from the sun and then converting that into high-powered microwaves. And once again, lasers. That could happen too. Lasers and microwaves. That's Space Wars. So the US space plane has been up there 4,000 days worth of experimenting in space, much of it very confidential. China's also got this sort of space drone that they're doing similar stuff with. And let me just pause and remind you that a lot of this stuff that we're doing now was thought up decades ago. During the Cold War, people were thinking of crazy ideas. There was actually a program that was nicknamed Star Wars. Rods from God, the thing that we started the video with the rods going down to Earth, that was thought up during the Cold War. A lot of this stuff was conceived during that time. It was too expensive and impractical, but they were thinking of this stuff. One of the programs during that time was called Brilliant Pebbles, and it was a missile defense shield idea. You put a bunch of satellites up into space, and those satellites are just going around Earth waiting and waiting and waiting. And the moment that your enemy launches a rocket towards you, these satellites go down and they shoot the rocket down and you are safe. Brilliant Pebbles. Incredibly expensive and complicated in the 80s. But guess what? A couple months ago, Donald Trump takes office, Elon Musk by his side, and guess what's back on the agenda? Brilliant Pebbles. Now rebranded as America's Iron Dome, aka
Golden Dome Missile Defense Shield.
And, not surprisingly, Elon Musk is the frontrunner to build the Golden Dome Missile Shield. Yeah, that makes sense. Right now there are no active weapons in space, blow things up weapons. If this goes forward, there will be missiles in space that, again, are there for defense, but could easily be turned a little bit this way and be turned into a weapon to take out another satellite. And then there's nukes. Man, this one freaks me out. So back in the Cold War, there was talk of putting a nuclear weapon in orbit and just having it there.
I guess the crazy idea was are people going to have weapons stationed in space that then you drop on Earth?
But this was the Cold War. Crazy ideas were the name of the game. Soviet Union and the United States both put nukes super high up into the atmosphere and detonated them just to see what would happen, kind of testing this idea out. And sure enough, it completely obliterated a huge portion of the satellites that were going around Earth at the time. There weren't a ton back then, but it did some real damage. Not because of an explosion, but because of an electromagnetic pulse, radiation that goes in and kind of messes with the electronics of these orbiting satellites. So not good. And in fact, so not good that the Soviet Union and the United States decided to sign an agreement where they say, we promise not to do any nukes or weapons of mass destruction in space. So at least from orbit. We still send ICBMs with nuclear warheads into space to then go down, but having them in orbit all of the time was just a little too risky. They do have limits, it turns out.
We are taking the first firm step toward keeping outer space free forever from the implements of war.
And that's been kind of our one big treaty in governing weapons in outer space. We don't really have an international framework around this. And in fact, that very treaty is now being tested.
Russia is developing a nuclear weapon in space.
In a big drama that occurred last year, US intel came out that said that Russia actually has the capability to put a nuke in space. And for a hot minute, there were people saying that there is a nuclear weapon in orbit that Russia has launched.
We think Russia has put a nuclear device in orbit.
Big freak out, super scary. Turns out there wasn't a nuclear weapon in space, but there was a weird Russian satellite that was in graveyard orbit, but it was active. It was kind of doing some weird stuff. And the US military insisted that this was and is a part of a program that Russia has to eventually put a nuclear warhead in orbit.
Some type of anti-satellite nuclear capability, nuclear weapon that would be based in space. That's what the allegation is.
If we are unable to convince them otherwise to ultimately fly a nuclear weapon in space, which would be an indiscriminate weapon, doesn't have national boundaries, doesn't determine between military satellites, civilian satellites, or commercial satellites.
And how do we know that they have this?
And here's where you have me, again, at a disadvantage. I'd be happy to have this conversation in a classified session.
So we don't know.
We are concerned about it, the department and the entire administration, and I know this Congress is taking this deadly seriously.
So you'd say, well, wow, would Russia really do that? I think what has happened, though, is that Russia is the declining space power. They're driving around a 1989 Buick. It's still working. It's reliable. It's testament to Soviet engineers that the systems work as well as they do. They're not launching new stuff. They're not making new technology.
Now, Russia flatly denies that they're doing this. And in fact, Putin has come out and said he doesn't want an arms race in space. And of course he doesn't. Russia's a declining space power. But he's framing it as kind of this moralistic high ground of saying, we don't want an arms race in space. But the US is like, no, Putin, we see you. You're developing a nuclear weapon to put into space to get the ultimate leverage over the rest of us because we are surpassing you. So the next month, April 2024, everyone's at the UN, it's the UN Security Council, and the US, with Japan, puts out this resolution that says, why don't we all sign a promise that we want to reaffirm that treaty that says no WMD or nukes in space. Everyone, let's just reaffirm it. And guess what? Russia vetoes the resolution. And boom, the US is like, gotcha. We know that you're actually not serious about this. You want to put a nuke in space. Why didn't you sign this resolution?
Why, if you are following the rules, would you not support a resolution that reaffirms them? What could you possibly be hiding?
So then, in a kind of wild defensive gambit in geopolitics, Russia drafts their own resolution that says, we want to ban all weapons in space, quote, for all time. They're like, we don't want to just reaffirm the old treaty. We want to ban all weapons in space. Stop the arms race. And guess what? The US vetoed this. And now Russia is like, ha, now you are the one who wants to weaponize space. We said we want to ban it for all time and you vetoed it. I'm painting this picture because I want you to see that there is a tense set of negotiations that are heating up about what do we do with weapons in space? Where do we pump the brakes? And so far the countries can't quite agree. And so the status quo of it being the Wild West up there continues. And boy, do I hope that that changes soon. Because in my opinion, there is no reason why we can't cooperate up there. It's space. It's not land and territory and borders and ethnic identities and language. It is space. And it is my hope that even though space is going to become a bigger, more crowded, more militarized place, these countries can figure out a way to talk to each other and put on some brakes on how far they're willing to go to weaponize all of this. Because weaponizing it doesn't actually help any of us. So until these countries can come to the table and actually agree on something, stop playing these mind games, it's going to continue to be this arms race. China will continue to catch up to the US and their space capabilities. Elon Musk will continue to get very rich off of all of this. The US will forge ahead with all of its secretive capabilities that we'll someday learn about. And space, up there with all those satellites, will certainly be a big part of any future conflict.